I want to start off today's show with a message somebody sent me, and I just can't do it justice trying to repeat it to you or remember it from memory. So I'm just going to read in their own words. James let me know that, "I'm sorry, sir, but you have just exposed the major shortcoming in your life. You're product of a poorly educated provincial upbringing. You have a strong inability to accept the fact that the world is complicated and cosmopolitan, which it's been since the Age of Enlightenment. You really have to learn that at a certain point, you need to leave these concerns of yours in the hands of your betters." Well, James, today we're going to discuss comments from you, as well as comments from people that disagree with us on a lot of issues, but engaged with an incredible degree of civility. And we're going to go through and we're going to address, which has become, I think, probably one of the most controversial issues that we've taken on this show. And that is the Israel-Palestinian conflict that has been going on for arguably well over 75 years now, but ever since the agreement in 1947 and the establishment of the Jewish state, that's when there has been almost nonstop conflict between the Jews living in the Levant and the Arabs living in the Levant. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to address some of the points that have been brought up in the comment sections on Instagram, on YouTube. We're going to address some of the concerns that people sent to me in direct messages. And again, we had a lot of hate, but we also had a lot of people that simply wanted to provide a different perspective. And so we're going to go through that today, and we're going to see if I got it wrong or if I messed it up somewhere, and hopefully provide everybody with a little bit more information, a little bit more perspective on how to be able to effectively analyze what is going on in the Middle East and to hopefully be able to make a good argument. All of that and more coming up in this episode of Making the Argument, powered by Good Ranchers.
I am super excited for today's episode. You may hear me, but you cannot see me because we had some technical difficulties, and I had to sacrifice my camera so Queen of the Bees could have hers. So we're going to have a great episode today. Anyway, if you haven't already, go down to the link in the description and join our community chat. We've been having some great conversations there. There's been so many new posts in our discussions thread and our episode ideas thread, and we've been enjoying it an incredible amount. So go down to the link in the description, sign up, and we'd love to meet you there.
All right, as always, I am Nick Freitas, your host, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but other than that, a good guy. And then for, again, some of the purposes here, I also have a background in counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, unconventional warfare as a former Green Beret, did a couple combat tours over in Iraq, and I've also studied a fair amount of both the history as well as conflict over in the Middle East. So we're going to determine today if I'm as ignorant as some of the people seem to believe I am. Back with us, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone. I'm having some issues with my computer, so I'm not going to get to interact with you on the chat as I normally do. So I'm very sorry about that.
And then we have our political prognosticator, our resident historian, and our mostly benevolent warlord in training, Christian. How you doing, Christian?
I just want to let everybody know that I had a provincial upbringing. I grew up in the rural South pretty much my whole life.
Yeah,
so.
I do love it when somebody tells me that when they say you're product of a poorly educated provincial upbringing, and it's
your
just full of spelling and grammatical errors. And then, of course, we have our producer of producers, the good Hamilton,
with no camera,
doesn't like central banking, with no camera right now, so you're just going to hear him.
You're just going to hear me.
No change for our audio listeners, though.
Yeah, no change. Yeah. Your audio listeners, like, no big deal. We're
don't
cool.
care.
Okay, so once again, I want to clarify something right off the bat. We're going to talk about a lot of the hate mail that received, but we're also going to give time to people that reached out to us who I thought were very polite, very civil, and wanted to ask some questions or wanted to provide some other information or perspective that they thought I was lacking or missing. And so we're going to take a look at all of that. Couple of ground rules for this. We want the audience participation for this. We're going to go through a lot of these comments. Like I said, some good, some bad, some in between. But we also want to be able to take questions and potentially field some, statements and whatnot from the audience as well. So please feel free to do that. I actually spoke to some of the people in direct messages on my Instagram account and encouraged them to be able to come on this episode and to watch and to engage, because I am going to be playing some of the videos that they sent me so we can do some analysis on it. One of the things I want to make sure that we're clear of up front, there's a lot of terms that get thrown around when we're discussing this conflict. Zionism, genocide, terrorism. We're going to talk about what these terms mean. right? We're going to establish some objective criteria for what these terms mean, because if we can't actually agree on objective definitions, then you essentially remake them to fit your own narrative. And we don't want to do that. We want to look at what do these terms actually mean when they're discussed about? Are there any official definitions, legal definitions, et cetera? So we'll get into that. The other thing that we want to do, and we're encouraging everyone in the chat to do, is we realize that this is a passionate issue. And so try to be respectful to one another in the chat, and maybe hopefully we'll have a good conversation about this. All right, so let's look at some of the hate first, because quite frankly, it's some of the most fun to go on. All right, so Sanamaj5 said, please educate yourself on what's happening in Gaza right now and what's been happening in Palestine for the past 75 years, #free Palestine. What I find interesting about these comments is that I'm a little bit more sympathetic to them when they happen on my Instagram. And the reason why is because on Instagram, we're doing like 60-second reels. So there's not a lot of room to like delve into the nuances of every issue, right? That's not really what Instagram reels is for. But we have done a couple of episodes on this where we have gone back into the history. But there's always this assumption that if you take a particular position, it must be because you're uneducated or stupid, right? Which honestly is a little bit better than the people that think I'm just downright evil, right? That's the other narrative that I get from the hate mail. But it's this idea of please educate yourself on what's happening in Gaza right now and what's been happening for Palestine for the past 75 years. What I find interesting about comments like this, and you're going to see more, is that if you have watched our previous episodes, we didn't just look at what was happening in Palestine for the past 75 years. We went back 3,000 years. All right, so this idea that we're somehow uneducated about the very long, rich, complex, nuanced history of this region, I'm sorry, but whenever somebody tells me, well, have you considered the past 75 years? I'm like, I'm just going to tell you, my knee-jerk reaction when somebody says that is, if you honestly think this only goes back 75 years, then maybe I'm not the one that's uneducated on this particular issue. Because there's at least a good 3,000 years of history, which does a lot to explain the perspectives from both the Jewish perspective and the Arab perspective, as well as you could say the Roman perspective, the Ottoman perspective, the English perspective, right? There's
the Persian and Babylonian perspective,
the Persian, the Assyrian perspective, the Egyptian perspective. There is a lot of perspectives on this particular region. And, varying degrees of relevance. But I don't think if you're just looking at the past 75 years, I don't think you can possibly have even begin to scratch the surface of why this is such a complicated issue. All right. So
we did that though in an episode.
No, I know we
tried
did.
to go through. It was a lot, right? But we tried to go through over 3,000 years, going back to the Bronze Age.
Well, even when you went through it, people were commenting that, oh, you missed this thing and you missed that thing.
Yeah, because if you're
sorry that we can't cover the history of the entire world in one podcast, but we've tried before with the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
But
let's go to the next comment. I think there's a couple more from Sanamaj 5. Just one thing, please educate yourself on this matter. You are blindly supporting Israel.
Educate yourself.
Again,
I get so sick of hearing people say educate yourself.
This is always the thing of, educate yourself as assuming that if you have a position that they don't agree with, it must be because you're ignorant or evil. And by the way, just so everyone knows, and we might actually talk about this a little bit today, we don't blindly support Israel. I do believe that Israel has a right to exist, right? I do believe that Israel has a right to a homeland and to a Jewish state in the Levant. I do, but I don't blindly support Israel. There's been plenty of decisions that have been made by the government of Israel that I did not like, not the least of which is their financing of weapons to Azerbaijan and the conflict that's going on with the Armenians right now. Again, when you look at the case of the USS Liberty, ton of unanswered questions there. So, again, this idea that I just blindly support Israel, I'm sorry, it's not true. And if you look at the in-depth conversations we've had, we've demonstrated that. Nick J. Freitas, after 1,000 people killed in a few days, including children, you're only concerned about the white flag and an anti-Israeli protest.
Hang on, I'm going to pull up the Taliban flag. I'll send it to Hamilton.
So we made a comment on a reel that we thought was, let's just say, ironic. And what it was there was a group of women who were protesting downtown. I can't remember what city it was in the United States, but they were protesting downtown, and one of the women was carrying a Taliban flag. Now, keep in mind, these women were dressed in Western clothing. They had makeup on, they had jewelry on, they didn't have any head coverings, nothing like that. And they were protesting in a public setting without any men escorting them. And I was basically pointing out that it was pretty ironic that you would be carrying the Taliban flag because, after all, the Taliban are just such huge supporters of strong, independent women speaking in public without, male supervision. And this is the flag they were carrying, right? This was not this idea that it was just a white flag. No, it was the Taliban flag, and I made that explicit. And so that's why when I get comments like that telling me, educate yourself and you don't care about, you don't care about 1,000 people dying in Gaza. You just care about this flag. No, two things can be true at the same time. I can care about innocent people dying no matter where they're dying. And I can also think that it's horribly ironic for, again, a bunch of women downtown by themselves with makeup on, wearing Western clothes, no head covering, protesting in public without a male escort, because the Taliban would beat the crap out of you for doing that. I'm sorry, if you cannot see the irony in that, that's not my fault. And I'm not obligated to mention every single thing that is happening in the world as I'm making an observation about one thing that is happening. All right, here's another. This one was one of my favorites. Kobe said this. So in one of the videos that I did talking about what was going on in Israel and Gaza, I tried to explain to people that, look, I don't support innocent people dying wherever they're dying, and I don't support, and obviously I believe that anybody engaging in military actions should be taking necessary, appropriate, and reasonable steps to prevent civilian casualties, right? I do think that's something that military should do. And I was pointing out that, look, I've studied this part of the world. I've engaged in counterterrorism operations. This idea that I'm ignorant and I don't care about innocent people dying is just, it's false. It's a false narrative. And this guy responded with, "Cry me a river, you sound like a pansy, LOL. Innocent lives, blah, blah, blah. I fought in the army, blah, blah, blah. I care, blah, blah, blah. Great misdirect and manipulative response to shed light on Israel bombing children as justification." Again, not sure what he meant to say there. "You are a sorry, pathetic excuse. As a vet, in my eyes, you aren't for the innocent lives. You are for the continued ethnic cleansing of a culture from an apartheid state that has no grounds in stealing land and killing people. This is what America is standing behind. Wake the F up."
Lots of typos.
Yeah, lots of, okay. But again, that happens. I'm not crushing people on typos on Instagram. Here's what I do want to say though. I really don't care if this dude thinks I'm a pathetic vet. It means it has absolutely no bearing on my self-esteem. Sorry. This whole idea that you're not for innocent lives, you're for the continued ethnic cleansing of a culture. Okay, here we go. One of these terms, right? Let's go ahead and look at this. And I'm going to type it up right now. And because, all right, the official United Nations definition of ethnic cleansing is rendering an area ethnically homogenous by using force or intimidation to remove from a given area persons of another ethnic or religious group. Okay, so here's my question. Are you not allowed to be an Arab living in Israel? Are you not allowed? Oh, it turns out you are. It turns out there's, I think close to 1 million Arab citizens.
Turns out there's Arabs in the Israeli parliament.
Oh my gosh, there's Arabs. So let me get this straight. Israel, according to this guy, Israel is engaging in ethnic cleansing. Here's the definition, once again, at least from the United Nations, right on it. Rendering an area ethnically homogenous by using force or intimidation to remove from a given area persons of another ethnic or religious group. Okay, so does Israel actively work within its borders to remove Arabs and Muslims?
The nuanced take is they do actively work to remove people that are connected to groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and stuff like that.
Sure.
I mean,
but that's affiliation with an
So is what they're
organization.
saying basically that if you're trying to remove terrorists, then you're persecuting Muslims? Because that's a take that's a little bit assuming that if you're a terrorist, you must be a Muslim.
Well, I mean, to answer, so what he's trying to get at, what he's suggesting is basically he's making the claim effectively that Israel is pushing the Palestinian people out of the Levant and exterminating them. Basically, he uses, it's his phrasing, not ours, right? He uses the phrase ethnic cleansing.
Yes.
In here. So, and also grounds and stealing land and killing people. We've talked about this before.
But I want to take this one step at a time because this is important. When you talk about ethnic cleansing, if you are an Arab, if you are a Muslim, right? So, and understand when we talk about Palestinians, what we're largely referring to is the people living in the Levant who are predominantly Arab ethnically, along with some other ethnic groups that want basically an Arab or a Muslim state. That's what they want in the Levant. Like this whole idea of Palestinian, we can go back on the history of that, but essentially that area had been known as either Israel or Judea for centuries until Hadrian came in with 12 legions, committed genocide, like actual genocide against the Jews, renamed Jerusalem, and then renamed Judea as Palestine.
So
the
counter argument though is that where did he get the name from?
Okay, here's my point though. Here's my point on the ethnic cleansing part.
Okay.
If you're going to engage that Israel, or if you're going to suggest that Israel is engaging in ethnic cleansing, then what we have to do is we have to say, okay, does Israel want a state? Yes. Does Israel want a Jewish state? Yes. Does Israel prevent people from other ethnicities becoming citizens in Israel? No. In fact, Muslims, Arabs hold positions of parliament. They're judges. They serve in the military. They own businesses. They do all of that within Israel. They do all of that within Israel with full legal rights as Israeli citizens. Now, if you're going to try to make distinctions between Palestinians or Arabs living in the West Bank or Gaza who are not Israeli citizens, well, then obviously they're not going to be afforded the same rights as Israeli citizens, right? That is true of just about every country on earth. Now, here's my question. Do Jews living under Palestinian authority, either in Gaza with Hamas,
well,
right?
There are no Jews living in.
Oh, there aren't?
In Gaza.
There aren't. Wow, that's interesting. That's interesting. Or the West Bank. The West Bank's a little bit different. Then you do have interaction there. So here's what I'm saying. When you look at the actual definition of ethnic cleansing, I don't accept, nor do I find there to be sufficient evidence that Israel is engaging in deliberate ethnic cleansing. I just don't. I do find that to be true of Hamas and Gaza. So I'm not sure if you want to throw around the ethnic cleansing a lot. And again, I can make a distinction between Palestinians and Hamas. All right, let's make that important distinction. There's a distinction between Palestinian and Hamas. Please go back. Thanks. The other point that I wanted to say here is that an apartheid state. Okay, once again, what is an apartheid state? Because we're not just going to throw out these terms and pretend that we're going to accept it no matter what anybody says. An apartheid state, and this is largely based off of what they did in South Africa, it's a policy or system of segregation or discrimination on the grounds of race. So once again, I will ask, in the Israeli government, are you directly discriminated against because of your race? I no. Because once again, you can be an Arab Israeli citizen and have all the rights conveyed to an Israeli citizen. So where's the apartheid state? And the reason why they bring this up is because of the way they treat Gaza and the West Bank. Well, okay, first of all, now we're not talking about Israel controlling its own borders. We're now talking about an area, especially with Gaza, because there is an Israeli presence in the West Bank. But Israel left Gaza back in 2005. Left it back in 2005. And so the argument is that how are they imposing an apartheid state in Gaza? The people in Gaza are allowed to have their own elections. They get billions of dollars in foreign aid coming into that country. What obligation does Israel have to Gaza, especially when they're not inside it governing it? So once again, I have a problem with this idea that Israel is running an apartheid state.
The argument, the counter argument to that is, and this is an extreme comparison.
No, go ahead. Yeah, that's what we want.
It's an extreme comparison, but the counter argument will be, well, for a long time, the Germans did not physically occupy the Warsaw Ghetto, but we would still call that an occupation in the sense that, yeah, there weren't German soldiers walking around the streets of the Warsaw Ghetto, but they had control over that, and then eventually they did liquidate it, right? Obviously, that's an extreme comparison. Anytime that you make comparisons to the Nazis, that's an extreme comparison.
But the issue here too, though, is that, I mean, we need to stay focused on apartheid. How is what Israel doing?
No, I'm talking about Gaza. The argument that people make that Gaza is under Israeli occupation, and then the response is, well, Israel pulled out in 2005. And then the counter to that is, sure, Israel could have pulled out in 2005, but maintaining a land and sea blockade of the Gaza Strip is tantamount to occupying it because you're cutting it off from the rest of the world. You're controlling it without having boots on the ground controlling the territory.
But here's the issue, though, right? First of all, Israel doesn't control the entire border with Gaza. But Israel does have a right to control its border with Gaza, just like Gaza has a right to control its border with Israel. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the naval blockade, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think Israel uses its Navy except in times of conflict, in times of like all-out war, like you're saying right now, to block every sort of trade leaving the port from Gaza. And again, Gaza shares a border with Egypt. And it's funny because Egypt likes to put up a lot of walls in between Gaza and Egypt. So once again, I have this problem with, well, they're occupying it because they're protecting their border. No, that's not accurate. Occupation would be if you actually have troops on the ground occupying it in a way to where you're essentially controlling the flow of goods and services and everything else. And I don't believe that's an accurate representation of what's going on. But again, even that would be a little bit different from an apartheid state. So once again, we have two claims in here: ethnic cleansing. I'm sorry, I don't believe it fits the definition. And then an apartheid state. Once again, I don't believe it fits the definition. But they want to insist that they can throw out these terms and you're not allowed to disagree with them, even when you bring up the definition and you bring up pretty solid points about, well, if that were true, then why are these things happening? And so I'm not going to accept people just throwing out claims all the time without bothering to provide evidence for why they're true. Let's go to the
I love the wake TF up, like that's somehow going to convince you.
Yeah, he got me there. Okay, another point of view says, next, when you watch the genocide of your land for 70 years, why wouldn't the victims cheer, educate yourself on the Nakba? Okay, let's look at genocide. That's what we're doing here today. We're going to actually look at these terms. So what is genocide? So let me see here. Let me bring it up. All right. In the present convention, this is from the United Nations. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Killing members of the group, causing seriously bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And if you look at kind of the, let me see where... Another one would be the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group.
Well, has this definition changed at all over time?
Yes, it
that
has.
First definition you read is not the definition I learned in school.
No, and if we look at
the definition I learned in school was basically you're trying to wipe out an entire race of people.
Yeah.
And now it's, you might be inflicting mental, pain.
Well, there's a reason why the United Nations keeps broadening these terms out more and more over time. And part of it might be understandable. So for instance, if a country doesn't deliberately go in and start murdering everyone, but they isolate your country in such a way to where, you are unable to get food and water and you eventually die out.
No, that I understand that. Yeah. But there was just something in that first definition that kind of reminds me of this new leftist term for violence where it's like words can be violent.
Yeah.
Like an example of, I can't believe I'm about to give the United Nations their due for once. I totally disagree with the idea that inflicting mental anguish is akin to genocide. That sounds like something that the trans people on Reddit would be talking about. But like an example, a more recent example of this would be what Azerbaijan was doing in Artsakh to the Armenians. After the 2020 war, Azerbaijan won, but they weren't able to completely expel the Armenians from Artsakh. But by the way, the Armenians have been living there for like over 2,000 years. But there was a narrow corridor that connected Artsakh, which was a breakaway ethnic Armenian state inside of internationally recognized Azerbaijani territory, to the Republic of Armenia. There was a narrow corridor that was still intact even after that war in 2020 called the Lachin corridor. And what the Azerbaijanis did was they blockaded that corridor. They shut it off. And so in doing so, they completely isolated Artsakh from the rest of the world. And it wasn't like that they were denying the transfer of weapons to Artsakh. That would have been one thing. In fact, there were Russian peacekeepers there that were supposed to prevent the transfer of weapons anyway. So it wasn't like anything similar to what Israel was doing with Gaza, which was, we don't want weapons getting into the hands of Hamas. Yeah. No, they cut it off with the intention of like depriving like fuel and food from traveling through that corridor to actually allow the people living in Artsakh to, keep their lights on or eat
Yeah.
And
whereas in Gaza, Israel was actually providing electricity
and water.
Israel was.
And Azerbaijan was actively working to shut off those type of things. Yeah. And they succeeded. I mean, unfortunately, they invaded like a month ago and completely took over the territory and now drove the people out. That would be an appropriate definition for a genocide, with the intention of driving a people out or destroying them, right? Without necessarily invading and then shooting everybody. Yeah. But using other means to do so.
The other thing that's problematic about this is if you look at the etymology of the word genocide, you go back to Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin. He coined the term genocide in his 1944 book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, right? In Axis Rule, Lemkin documents his research of Nazi occupation policies in Europe and records a case of studying the occupation of Poland. Lemkin asserted that Nazi atrocities against Poles consisted of 5 policies which exposed their intent to destroy the Polish nation. This included mass killing of Poles, inflicting seriously bodily or mental harm to members of the group, planned deterioration of living conditions calculated to bring about their destruction, implementation of various measures intended to prevent births within the group, such as promotion of abortions, burdening pregnant women, and forced transfer of Polish children to German families, right? So this is where you also get the United Nations kind of breakdown of the things that they were including. When you look at the experience between Israel and the Levant, all right, and the Palestinians in Israel, I'm sorry, I don't think you can accurately use this definition of genocide and say that is what the Israelis are doing. I just don't.
Well, these same people are also calling members of Hamas soldiers and giving them the legitimacy of being, oh, well, these are just the Palestinian people defending themselves. And so they're conflating Hamas and Palestinian, and then they're also conflating soldier versus terrorism or just terrorist.
So, again, this is once again this is why it becomes very difficult for me to accept when somebody's coming in and critiquing something and they use terms like ethnic cleansing, apartheid, genocide. You are engaging in hyperbolic language that doesn't accurately depict what is actually going on the ground. I'm sorry. And I'm not saying that because I'm biased toward Israel. I'm saying that because we have examples of ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and genocide in other parts of the world, and other parts of the world, and this doesn't meet the definition. Now, if you want to claim it does meet the definition, then you're going to have to actually provide examples, not just simply declare it to be so. And then you can't provide examples. And this is the crazy part. If you're then going to provide examples which actually describe what Hamas has tried to do, or what other Arab states have tried to do against the Jews in that area, don't you find any problems with respect to your overall argument? Don't you find any problems with your own intellectual consistency and accuracy? And John Rice pointed out in the chat, he goes, I don't think Nick is uneducated. I think he's biased. Okay, well, here's the deal. I will be happy to admit that I have a general bias toward Israel. But it's not an unassailable bias, right? Like, I have a bias toward the United States and international affairs. But when you can show me that the United States has done something wrong, I agree with you and I critique my own country. I've done that several times, right? I've critiqued Israel 3 times on this show so far. So this idea that, am I more willing to do I have a bias toward Israel over Hamas? Yes. And I believe that bias is well-founded. Now, what does bias mean in that context? It means that when I get reports from something coming out of the Middle East, I am less likely to trust Hamas than I am Israel. It doesn't mean I don't have any skepticism toward either. I always try to engage with a healthy degree of skepticism based off of the information that I'm consuming. But if I see reports of Hamas committing terrorist attacks, I generally assume that's true, because I've read the Hamas charter. They don't mind engaging in terrorist attacks. So why would I question that when they tend to celebrate it and telegraph that that's what they're going to do and plan to do because they consider it a perfectly legitimate form of warfare?
And then they claim it after they do it.
Yeah.
They put out press releases and things like that to claim these actions.
Yeah, so so this is part of the problem I have is like I feel like genocide, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, when I see people lead with these things, I automatically think, okay, maybe I have a bias, but you clearly have one as well. And your bias is not just rooted in this idea of concern for the plight of the Palestinian people or support for various organizations. And we're going to get some other people on here that say, look, Nick, I make a distinction between Palestinians and Hamas. And we're going to get to their comments because I think they're bringing up valid points that we should discuss.
There were actually a couple of really good questions and really good constructive pieces of criticism that we saved. There's a super chat that I think Hamilton wants to read, and it's a really good one.
Let's definitely do that. This one is from Swimmers Pack 40K. Guys, you were missing the point. The labels they use are not about intellectual honesty. It is only a power game. Engaging with them in this is playing their game and losing by default.
So I don't disagree that it is part of a propaganda power game. The reason why I'm pointing it out is because and again, we're going to get to that, right? But the reason why we point it out initially is because typically, and we hear this, we see this all the time to varying degrees, right? We see it in the West a lot in the United States and academia, where we talk about colonization, or where we talk about privilege, or we talk about white fragility, or we talk about racism. And we've pointed out several times on this show that there are some people on the left, and we usually make a distinction between liberals and leftists, but there's a lot of people on the left that will throw out these accusations, and you're absolutely right. It's not about being intellectually consistent to the definition of the terms. It's a power play. And I agree with you. I think people that are doing this right now are engaging in a power play. And the whole reason why I point it out is because I want the audience to understand that if you're going to use certain terminology which doesn't fit the actual description of what's going on, then one of two things is possible. You're either ignorant as to what the term is, right? Or you're lying. You're engaging in hyperbole in order to achieve an objective, right? And I find that really problematic. All right, let's go on to the next one here. All right, so says Nick Freitas, brainwashed. Let someone get to your house, beat you up every day, then the day you fight back, I come to you and say he has the right to stay and live on your house in peace, and you're a terrorist. You need to stop giving your brain a break. It's time to use it. This is just insanity, right? So what you're saying is that the Israelis, I guess presumably since 1947, have just been randomly going into Gaza and beating people up, and they finally just decided to fight back. Except that's not what happened. It's not even close to what happened. Now, let me say this. Let me give as generous an interpretation of this as possible. I have no doubt that if you're a Palestinian living in Gaza, and living conditions are pretty bad, right? Living conditions are pretty bad, and you've been told your entire life growing up that it's all the fault of the Jews, that you are probably thinking that it is all their fault. I also understand that if you've been growing up in Gaza and a rocket attack or a missile attack has come in, or an artillery barrage has come in and blown up something or killed someone close to you, I completely understand why you would be mad at the people that launched that attack. I get that. I completely understand that. But this idea that what just happened here, right? Because this is his definition, is that this was just something where the Israelis, the IDF, whoever it was, is just constantly beating up these people. And so one day Hamas decided to cross over, rocket a bunch of kibbutz, kill innocent people, rape women, and then carry off hostages. And hey, that's just them fighting back. No, I'm sorry, that is not just them fighting back. And it isn't. And this is the part where, again, when somebody is engaging in a terrorist act, and when we talk about terrorism, the broad definition that we use with respect to terrorism as an individual that is engaging in unlawful acts of violence or intimidation against non-combatants or civilians in order to achieve a political objective. That's generally how we distinguish a terrorist act from what we might call a legitimate military act. So, for instance, if Hamas crossed over the border and only attacked Israeli border checkpoints and military targets, I would sit here and I would distinguish between those two things. I would say, okay, maybe you don't agree with it, maybe you don't like it, but Hamas deliberately targeted what they perceived to be military targets, not farming communities. But that's not what Hamas did. And I'm sorry, I'm not obligated to ignore that or treat it as if it's just fighting back. So even if somebody is looking at this going, I feel like the Israelis are the ones responsible for my current conditions, I feel that they've attacked me and I want to respond. Well, if you responded by attacking military or even police targets within Israel, I would at least understand the motivation that you were trying to go after the people that are potentially responsible, whether I agree with your analysis or not, for actually inflicting damage. But when you kill and rape women at a music festival
and decapitate toddlers,
like I'm sorry, I don't. That's not just you fighting back. That's not just you fighting back. All right, let's look at
Nick, real quick. We've been talking about bias and everything of that nature. I have to admit, I am pretty biased towards a lot of things, and one of those things is Good Ranchers.
Wow, I don't know if that's the transition I would have gone for there.
Well, we weren't
Hamilton.
sure you were ever going for the transition,
Oh my
so that's why
gosh.
it had to be done.
Well,
I want to take the credit for writing that odd transition in our chat that we have.
yeah, all right. So obviously, again, look, we usually do a lot of quirky transitions into our ads for Good Ranchers. We always try to be a little bit more respectful when we're talking about weighty issues like this. But we do want to give a huge thank you to Good Ranchers. It is we've just really enjoyed the partnership that we've had with them. And the Good Ranchers is one of the best ways that you can actually support this show. So if you are someone that enjoys American raised meats, we're talking poultry, we're talking pork, we're talking beef, we're talking wild caught seafood. If you enjoy all of that, if that is something that is a regular part of your menu, I'm going to tell you right now, go to Good Ranchers, try them out. You can use promo code Nick. You're going to get $25 off your order. You're going to get free shipping. There's all kinds of different programs they have there where you can actually protect yourself from inflation on this. You can sign into some of their subscriptions where you can get locked into a price and they will honor that price. And I'm not just talking for a couple months. Like we're talking like years, right? And then you can set up what that looks like. But again, if you're looking for a way to not only support your family and making sure that they're eating good quality food, right? Good quality food, but you also want to support this show, go over to Good Ranchers. Just give them a look. Give them a look, right? When you get done watching the show today, go over there. And if you've never checked out Good Ranchers before, go look at what they have to offer. I'm telling you right now, we have ordered a ton of stuff from them. We love it every time. And then I'm gonna end it with this. We have always had a commitment to our audience that we are not going to push a product simply because we may agree with the company ideologically. And in fact, to us, it's really important that if you're gonna say, hey, we're a company that believes in good American values, well, then you better make a good American product, right? You better make a good product that customers are going to enjoy. And I got to tell you, Good Ranchers just does an excellent job of it, and they have been great to work with.
And let me just say, you may not want to purchase today, and that's okay, but in a few weeks, there's some things coming from Good Ranchers regarding the holidays that I don't think you're going to be able to pass up, which is going to be awesome. For our audio listeners as well, there's a link in the show notes. Let's get right back to the show.
All right, so let's go to the next clip here.
See.
People are saying to my toddlers that have been decapitated, comment pictures or it didn't happen. I'm just going to say back pictures or it didn't happen on the other side too. How about that?
Jubilator said, it's also complicated. People trying to turn it into a black and white issue clearly don't understand the centuries old nuance. One of the things I really appreciated about this comment was that she didn't say 75-year-old nuance. She said centuries old nuance. And this is something that we've tried to address before. In fact, I was in another conversation with somebody on Instagram. He sent me a direct message. And we had a productive conversation, but I would say that the part that was kind of frustrating about this, and this is where the potential nuance comes in. I'm going to tell you right now, there's no nuance about Hamas attacking innocent women, children, deliberately attacking innocent women and children. There's no nuance about that. You're a terrorist organization, and I hope Hamas, and by the way, I've always been careful to distinguish between innocent civilians, Palestinians, Arabs living in the Levant, and Hamas. Hamas is an organization with a charter that believes certain things, that conducts certain operations. And I'm not going to apologize for hoping that organization gets destroyed, right? That's not Palestinians. That's not innocent civilians. But yes, I hope Hamas as an organization gets destroyed. But the part that she's talking about that I think is important here when it's about the centuries old nuance is this always goes back to the question of who has a right. Who can we make a good argument for having a legitimate right to a homeland or a state in the Levant, right? And for those that are wondering what I mean by the Levant, I'm generally talking about that area that starts kind of like at the north eastern edge of the Sinai and then goes up north all the way up till you get to about like Syria. But it generally includes, when we talk about the Levant as a geographical area, it generally includes Gaza, Israel, the West Bank, and then I would say probably parts of Levant and maybe Syria. But again, we're just talking about a geographical area, not like political lines. Right? I would say that's fair.
Why do you include Syria in that?
I said parts of it, like Golan Heights area and stuff like that. Because if you look at traditionally the Levant area and you look at maps of it, not most of Syria, just little parts.
The definition of the Levant that I've always used goes basically and argues that it's everything from the Sinai Peninsula up to the border of modern day Turkey, the coast of that, right?
Okay, well then
that includes the coast of Syria, the coast of Lebanon, the coast of modern day Israel, the Gaza Strip.
That's what I'm saying. It's kind of like if you look at where the Mediterranean meets Asia, it's that portion right there that again isn't Turkey, isn't Egypt or the Sinai. That's been kind of, and that's why I call it's a geographical marker, not a political marker.
Yeah, that was a problem. And by the way, that gets to what I was trying to hint at earlier when you said that Hadrian renamed the province of Judea to Syria Palestina. Or Palestina.
Yeah.
He pulled that name from the writings of Herodotus. So this is like 7th century BC.
Yeah.
And Herodotus referred to a coastal strip of a part of the Levant. See, this is all complicated because a lot of people use different phrases and words to describe the same thing.
Yeah.
Different historians from different cultures and different time periods will give geographic naming conventions to describe a piece of land that overlaps with other different geographic naming conventions. Yeah. And so Herodotus was writing and described a piece of the coastal strip of the southern Levant as he used, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but he used a phrasing that evolved over time to the modern day term that we call Palestine. And so when Hadrian renamed it to Palestine, he didn't just invent a name out of the ether.
No.
He actually pulled a name from a Greek historian who was writing at that point, like 600 years or 700 years before him, and then attributed that name to it. So this is part of the reason that a lot of...
Well, do you know why it was insulting to the Jews to call it Palestine? Because if you look at the etymology of it, it's from the Hebrew Pelesheth or Philistia. It's land of the Philistines.
I was going to say, are the Palestinians Philistines?
No.
I don't think that they are.
No, and it's interesting because even when you go into like Hebrew scripture and whatnot, there's kind of two terms for Philistines. One is more of kind of like a general term for like a foreigner, but then a lot of like the Philistine population, the theory is they actually pull their roots from various areas in what would be considered modern day Greece.
I was going to say that my understanding of the origin of the Palestinian people is that they're a combination of the native, actually, believe it or not, the native Greek settlers of the area, so like the Phoenician colonists, plus the Arab settlers that came in, especially after the Islamic conquests. And so on one hand, they can trace their lineage back arguably just as long as the Israelis when it comes to the Greek settlers. And then on the other hand, they still have very strong roots with the Arab world as well. And it's the fusion of those two things together that differentiates Palestinians from, say, Omanis or Egyptians or Libyans or any other Arab group that exists in other parts of the Arab world.
Yeah.
And that kind of gets to the heart of this comment, right? That it is complicated. It is complicated, and we tried to cover 3,000 years of history, but it is complicated.
And here's the conversation I was having with this gentleman before is that he was saying, well, it's unfair that you had Arabs or Palestinians living in this area for centuries, and then they basically just kick them out and give the Jews their own state. And I was like, well, wait a second.
That's not quite how that went down.
The Jewish people had a state going all the way back. I mean, they had a state in the Bronze Age, and they continually lived in the area for close to 3,000 years. They might not have been a majority population, but part of the reason why they weren't a majority population at various points is because there were deliberate actions on behalf of multiple governments to engage in either genocide against them or forcing mass diasporas. Right when the Assyrians destroyed the kingdom of Israel, I think around 780 BC, they uprooted a lot of the Jews and they transferred them to other parts of the Assyrian Empire. When the Babylonians destroyed the kingdom of Judea, and I think it was around 580 BC, and again, forgive me if I'm getting some of the dates wrong. I just know I think it was late 700s AD and then late 500s, BC and BC. When the Babylonians destroyed Judea, they took a massive portion of the Jewish population into exile to Babylon. That doesn't mean that there was no Jews left. In fact, it's deliberately written that there was Jews that were left behind in that area of Jerusalem and Judea. So, and we see the same thing as well when all of a sudden the Babylonian Empire is taken over by the Persians. And then we see a return from the Jews in Babylon to, again, the historic Israel and Judea. And then you see this with the Seleucid Greeks, and then you see it under the Romans with King Herod. And then this idea that in 1947, a bunch of Jews just showed up in Israel and they kicked out the Arabs in order to give them a homeland. I'm sorry, that's not an accurate rendition of history. The Jews have a claim going back to portions of this area, going back 1,000 years and more before Arab populations showed up in any sort of significant strength. In fact, it wasn't until I think the 630s AD that you had the Arab Caliphate come in and essentially kick the crap out of the Sassanid Persians.
In the 630s, they crushed the Sassanids and the Byzantines at Al-Qadisiyah and Yarmouk, respectively.
Yeah. And then essentially conquered the area known as Levant that at that point had been under Byzantine control.
Oh yeah, the whole in the decades immediately prior to that, the Levant had been contested between the Sassanids and the Persians in what's known as the last Great War of Antiquity. But that's a whole nother story. For if you like Heraclius, you know what I'm talking about. But or if you like Khosrow for that matter, but I doubt anybody does.
But then people will bring up, but for the last 75 years, I'm like, okay, but once again, this is why we're showing that this is a centuries old issue, because I'm not claiming that I don't understand why Palestinians would want their own state in the Levant. I'm not questioning why they would want that. I am going to point out that you have Lebanon, you have Syria, you have Egypt, you have Jordan. You have a lot of Arab countries in that area, but then the counter call is like, okay, great, but you still want to be kicked out of your home to make way. And all I would say on that is, okay, but what are you supposed to do? Because you did have a rather large Jewish population living in this portion of this part of the world at the time of 1947. And so if you're going to give the Jews a homeland, this makes sense for both historical reasons as well as population reasons. And again, the original agreement in 1947 was not kick all the Arabs out and give them the entire, historical area of Israel. It was, no, they're going to get a portion of it, a significantly smaller portion than what the kingdom of Israel or Judea would have been, especially Israel under the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon. You're going to give them a small portion of that, and then you're also going to set up another Arab state in the region for the Palestinians. The Palestinians and all the surrounding Arab countries rejected that. The Jews accepted it. Then there was a war. The Israelis won the war. I don't know. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. This is something that has happened time and time again throughout history. By the way, it's how most Arab countries came into existence. It was Arab conquest of lands that were not traditionally Arab lands.
I've noticed that decolonization, for some reason, suddenly stops at the 7th century AD.
Yeah, all of a sudden it's cool. It's perfectly fine. And then
we want to decolonize everything up until that point. Actually, that's not even true. They really want to decolonize everything up until the Battle of Manzikert. But
yeah, let's go. But again, this is complicated because everything I just said is not, this isn't Jewish propaganda. This isn't the Western media trying to hide what actually happened. These are verifiable historical facts.
Oh, if you want proof that the whole Jewish propaganda, Jews control the media is complete garbage, consider the fact that within hours of the claim from Hamas that Israel had bombed a hospital and killed 500 people, the New York Times and Washington Post immediately front page stories without any sort of verification whatsoever, leading with Israel bombs hospital, kills 500 people. And then guess what we found out? They didn't bomb a hospital, they bombed a parking lot. They didn't kill 500 people, and it wasn't even them, it was Hamas. That sent one of their own rockets that misfired and hit a parking lot and didn't hit a hospital, didn't kill 500 people. So literally all three aspects of the story completely fabricated from beginning to end. And yet, two of the most important newspapers in this country, I would argue two of the worst media outlets in this entire country, reported verbatim what Hamas was telling them. So this idea that Jews secretly control the media, man, they've really fallen asleep on the job, haven't they?
Well, I go back to the whole idea of, and this is why we're going to go on to this next one, because I think I think you bring us up a good point. This gentleman said, he goes, Nick, I never said you don't care, but I do wonder who cares. It seems to me innocent people are being killed because terrorists have taken over them. Now Israel is on them too. If I understand it correctly, the innocent people are stuck in the middle. How can they not be slaughtered? Is there a world where this is possible? I never attacked you. I simply want to understand. I care about all life, Israel and Palestine. I would love for all the killing to cease. Totally reasonable position.
Yeah.
Totally reasonable position.
And a reasonable question.
Yes, it really is. If I haven't said it enough, let me say it again. I don't want any innocent Palestinians or Israelis to get killed. I don't want that to happen. What I have a problem with is what appears to me to be intellectual inconsistency when looking at the nature of how people are dying in this region. So let me explain what I mean by that. This idea that the people in Gaza have been overtaken by terrorist organizations, that's not exactly true. They had elections and Hamas won the election in Gaza, right? So this idea that the people of Gaza had no say in who represented them is not accurate. Now, does that mean that everybody in Gaza is complicit with respect to what Hamas does? No, I don't believe they are. But I will say this, it does seem to me that Hamas, on the other hand, believes that every single Jew is responsible for what the Israeli government does. And so, once again, it's that intellectual inconsistency. What is it? Are the people in that country responsible for what their government does or not? And to what degree are they responsible? I would argue that people may bear some responsibility for the people that they elect, but if they don't engage in an actual direct terrorist attack, I don't think you can accuse them of the terrorist attack as a result of it. You may be able to question their decision. You may be able to look at them and say, well, you should probably vote differently next time. But I don't think you can say that, okay, well, every person living in Gaza is now guilty for something Hamas did. I don't think that's fair. But here's what I don't understand. If Hamas, launched the attack that they did, and Israel responds, well, Israel is going to respond by trying to target Hamas in Gaza. Hamas, we know this. Again, this is not Jewish propaganda. We know that Hamas puts its headquarters and its other locations in close proximity to things like hospitals, madrasas, and schools. Typically, hospitals, madrasas, schools, things like that are targets that you're supposed to avoid. So let me speak from some personal experience here. And I'm going to talk about it both. I'm going to talk about it from a training perspective. When we were at the Joint Training Center, the JRTC Joint Training Center over in Louisiana, and we'd basically do war games out there. At one point when I was with First Group, I was on a detail and I was actually assigned to one of our headquarters. And part of it was we had teams out in the area and they would call for fire, right? So, hey, we're under attack, troops in contact, calling for fire. So that could be artillery, that could be an airstrike, whatever it is. Part of what our job was is that we had to look at where they were calling for fire and we had to see if it was in close proximity to anything that would have been considered, collateral damage. So again, things like hospitals, things like schools, churches, mosques, synagogues, whatever. Now, if you have an organization that deliberately engages in attacks toward you and then hides all of their military equipment and their military headquarters and what would be considered legitimate military targets in close proximity to things that are not considered legitimate military targets, now you have a problem. It's one of the things that we use to distinguish between terrorists versus combatants. A combatant follows certain rules of warfare, right? They don't deliberately put civilians in harm's way in order to protect them, right? They don't deliberately put civilians in harm's way in order to win a propaganda campaign. But when an organization does this, right, they're supposed to lose legal status. They're supposed to lose legal status because now they're deliberately putting innocent people in harm's way. And this is where it poses a real problem for any military that's trying to get at those guys while at the same time trying to minimize civilian casualties. So what is one of the things that Israel does when they do that? They say, we're going to attack. You have this much time to evacuate before the attack starts. I will tell you right now, legally, it's really questionable on whether or not Israel has to do any of that. But they do it. And they do it in part because they know that there are civilians within close proximity to legitimate military targets, and so they provide an opportunity for them to leave. But then Hamas blasts over loudspeakers, encouraging people not to leave. Why would you do that? Why would you do that unless you know It's going to cause civilian casualties, and then you can use them for propaganda purposes. See, this is one of the issues that I have when we look at this in full context. It's not that I don't think it is horrible when a civilian in Gaza is killed as a result of an Israeli airstrike. But I have to ask the question, how are you supposed to get at the terrorists within that area if you say, okay, we're going to attack, everyone evacuate, the terrorists either encourage them to stay or at some points require them to stay because they want the pictures, because the West will come out and say, oh, well, I guess it's moral equivalency between Israel and Hamas, right? Can we at least understand that that is a bad thing to encourage? That is a bad tactic to encourage. But if you give them a propaganda victory when they engage in that sort of operations, you encourage them to continue to do it. And that's problematic. Now, can you do a critique of Israel and say that you think that they should be more careful, they should take more measures? Sure. But I do think it's appropriate to understand who is the one going out of their way to put civilians in danger. And the reason why I'm not willing to believe Hamas's narrative on this is because I know Hamas deliberately targets civilians. And we have evidence of Hamas deliberately preventing their own civilians from being able to leave dangerous areas. And so at some point you lose credibility on the story that you're telling if I know that you think that's a legitimate tactic. Now, it could be that Israel, again, theoretically, it could be that Israel takes advantage of that as well. But again, when you've made it a part of your overall military strategy, like Hamas has, then it becomes very difficult to believe you, even if you have a legitimate case, because you've demonstrated to me that you're willing to lie to me about what you're doing. All right, let's go to the next one.
We've got a super chat that we're going to get to right quick. From Jim Ross, I admit a bias towards Israel. The left and Hamas use the terms of liberals to conflate what each group does. Hamas uses Palestinian civilians as cover and a reason for their actions. Israel continually ceases military action.
No, and this is one of the key issues that we have to consider when we look at this topic, right? Because the words that are used, ethnic cleansing, genocide, whenever a supporter of Palestinians or whatever it is says that this is what Israel is doing, the question that you have to ask yourself is that, okay, one claim is that Israel is superpower and the Palestinians don't have the same military capability, which they don't have the same economic capability, which they don't. And so if Israel did really want to, like if they were actually dead set committed to committing genocide against Palestinians, they possess the capability. So why haven't they done it? Right?
Because they're not actually the evil monsters that they're accused of being.
Well, and now here's my question. Let's say roles reversed. And the Palestinians, let's say it's Hamas that has access to all the sophisticated weaponry, the heavy armor, Merkaba tanks, F-15 fighters. Let's say it's Hamas that has access to all of that. Would they commit genocide against? Would Jews still be living in this area, or would Hamas have committed genocide if they had the military and economic capacity that Israel did, and Israel had the military and economic capacity that Gaza did? I think they would wipe out the Jews. And so again, this is where I keep going back to this terminology that's being used and the evidence on the ground. I just don't see it. Okay. So Mitliv said, Nick Freitas, and Israelis are cheering when Palestinians are dying, and this is all by design. Congratulations that you still believe in propaganda and lies. So again, are Israelis cheering when Palestinians die? I'm sure some are. And I would disagree with that. I would not support any cheering for people dying based exclusively off of their nationality or their ethnicity or their religion. Like, I don't get that. The question is are Israelis cheering, right? So in general, are Israelis cheering because Palestinians are dying, or Israelis cheering when Israel pushes Hamas back into Gaza and then starts hitting Hamas locations in Gaza? Because here's the difference. If an Israeli is cheering because Hamas is getting hit back, that's legitimate. If an Israeli is cheering because an innocent Palestinian is getting killed somewhere, that's not legitimate. But how do you differentiate between the two? Like if I'm standing out there and I'm like, yes, they hit back against Hamas. And you say, so you want little kids to die in Gaza. No, I don't want that, but I do want Israel to hit back against Hamas. Like a reasonable person can make a distinction between those two things.
It's the weirdest thing. I feel like half these people are forgetting. Do you guys remember 9/11? And like when 9/11 happened, there were videos circulating everywhere of people in the streets, the Palestinian people specifically in the streets cheering at the towers falling down and Americans being killed.
We never see those videos anymore.
No, well, not anymore because we're supposed to forget all of that.
We don't need to see 20-something-year-old videos, though. You can just go 2 weeks ago and see, or you could go 3 days ago and see 100,000 people marching through London celebrating the fact that Hamas came in there and killed 1,200 innocent people.
And for anybody who thinks some of these the commentary from these people is intellectually dishonest is all I'm trying to say. This is ridiculous. There's people on every side who cheer when things happen. So it doesn't make everything that side's doing wrong or right.
Well, and here's what I don't understand. If this person had come out and said, I think it was horrible when Palestinians were cheering for, Hamas attacking Israel, and I think it's horrible, that would at least show me that there was some intellectual consistency within our argument. But no, instead it's just, and Israelis are cheering as Palestinians are dying. And then it's congratulations, you still believe in propaganda and lies. Like, oh my God.
I have to define what that is.
This is always the argument. This is always the argument when somebody says that. And by the way, both sides are capable of engaging in this sort of like ridiculous thing, but it's like, oh, you believe that? Well, I see you haven't woken up to the propaganda.
I remember 5 minutes ago when anti-Semitism was out, but apparently it's back in.
Well, it just, all right, let's go to the next one. Okay, here we go. This guy, NM Dick is his name, and it's...
Well, that's appropriate.
Protect the narrative, soldier. Protect the central banks, the Jewish elite, and the monopoly on violence. Pretend to be libertarian and promote retaliation and senseless bloodshed. Everyone must bleed to protect the sacred chosen Israelites. Typical status coward shill. Did you read Israel's history of crimes against humanity? Why do you think Hamas was formed in the first place? NPC, imperialist mouthpiece. NM Dick, I'm just going to read off what your comments were because it's so obvious that you are just anti-Semitic. Like that's what this comes down to. Like the Jewish elite and the monopoly on violence and protect the central bank. Like holy crap, how many times do I have to sit here and rail against central banking? Like this is how you know somebody is making a comment with no knowledge, no understanding,
they
and
just hate the Jews.
Pure unadulterated bias. When you're calling me an imperialist, right?
And an NPC.
And an NPC and a statist, right? I'm a statist now. Right. And protect the narrative, soldier. Yeah, it's just, this is
we've done whole podcasts literally calling for abolishing central banking.
Like, tell me you don't know who Nick Freitas is without telling me you don't know who Nick Freitas is.
Protect the central banks.
Yeah, that's nuts.
I didn't even need to read because then he just flies off the rails after that. But we've literally done multiple podcasts about hyperinflation is coming. Buy your gold bars.
This is the interesting part where you can tell that somebody you can read one comment and then you can probably predict everything else this guy believes about everything. But it's just absurd. Next one.
I love how you emphasized his name so hard.
Yeah, the only one finding out is civilians in Gaza. You're such a hero. Unsubscribing. Bye. Terrorism is when you occupy someone else's land, systematically dehumanize the people, ethnically cleanse the land, enforce apartheid laws, and commit genocide after genocide unchecked. Resistance for freedom was there before Hamas ever existed. So once again, what do we see? Terrorism when you occupy someone else's land, systematically dehumanize the people, and ethnically cleanse the land. We've already brought up the definition of terrorism. We brought up the definition of ethnic cleansing. We brought up the definition of apartheid. We brought up the definition of genocide. This guy either doesn't know what he's talking about or he's engaging in hyperbolic language in order to achieve a political objective because he already knows what he believes on this, and evidence is not something he cares about. And he goes, Free Palestine, or then the next guy says, hashtag Free Palestine, don't hate Muslims just because American media told you to. First of all, I don't know if you've watched American media ever, because the idea that American media is telling me to hate Muslims, are you out of your dang mind? Have you picked up a New York Times lately? Have you picked up a Washington Post lately? Have you watched MSNBC? This is another thing that drives me absolutely nuts. It's this idea that Western media is in the bag for conservatism and Israel. Are you serious right now?
Yeah, what a load of garbage.
Like the moment you tell me that, the moment I realize, oh, you must not watch any Western media. And this idea that I don't hate Muslims. Like I don't hate Muslims. Like I served, can I point, I tried to point this out. I served alongside Muslims. All of my interpreters over in Iraq that I went into several very dangerous, environments with, Muslim, helped them get back to America. Right? I still keep in touch with some of them. The people that we were largely protecting in the areas that I was in Iraq, it wasn't American civilians that were getting blown up by terrorists. It was Iraqi civilians. It was Muslims. So this idea that I hate Muslims because I don't agree with what Hamas is doing, or I don't buy the narrative that Israel has no right to exist, no legitimate claim to exist, that automatically translates into hating Muslims. Once again, when I see that, I tend to disregard whatever you say next, because I know it's already rooted in a faulty premise. And it's rooted in this super simple view of the world where if you said this, well, then automatically you must believe this. Next one. From the river to the sea, from the river to the sea, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Okay, so what this means is that they're going to destroy Israel. That's what it means. No Jewish state in Israel. In fact, another term that gets used a lot is Zionism. I'm gonna give you the definition for Zionism right now, because it's another one that
yeah, I'm hearing that a lot.
Yeah, well, because they act like, oh, you're a Zionist. Okay, well, here's what Zionism means.
This is saying they want to wipe out all the Jews, basically. If you were wondering how the Holocaust suddenly took root, just look at this. Look at all of these people who are completely dehumanizing Israelis.
So here's what Zionism is. All right, here's what Zionism is. It's a movement originally for the establishment or reestablishment and the development and protection of a Jewish nation in what is now Israel. Right? It was established as a political organization in 1897 under Theodore Herzl and was later led by Chaim Weizmann. So Zionism, which I don't know if most people even understand what it is. Zionism is Judaism is a faith. Being a Jew can be both ethnic and religious. And then Zionism is the belief that the Jews should have a Jewish state, an established homeland, and that homeland should exist in the area that was traditionally Israel. That's what Zionism is. So for anybody that thinks it's some like just horrible, egregious concept, like I don't get that. Can I just point out the Arabs certainly believe that they should have states in this area of the world. What does that make them? Are they Arabists? Are they, what?
Arab nationalism is a thing.
Yeah. But and guess what? I'm not telling the Arabs that they should give back Egypt or Iraq or Syria or Jordan.
Oh, I'd love for them to give back Egypt. Return it.
It's more linked also.
Bring back the Ptolemies.
It's also more linked to religion. It's kind of like calling something Islamic. Well, calling something Zionist.
Islamic nationalism. I mean, the caliphate was a thing. Yeah. Islam, when it began, was a unified state
when you're basically your race is so intrinsically tied to your religion.
Well, that's kind of the problem, right? Because some people can be Israelis and actually be Christian, right? And some people can be Jewish and not be Israelis, and so you get into this muddy. You're kind of muddying the waters here. I will say that Zionism is the ethno-religious equivalent of neoliberalism nowadays. It's a term that everybody hates and they use as an insult, but nobody actually has a definition for it. Yeah. It's simply, I don't like this thing, therefore I'm going to call it X. Yeah. Nobody ever calls themselves a neoliberal in a positive sense. Yeah. It's something that the left and also certain elements of the right use to hurl as an insult, usually towards establishment-oriented politicians that believe in things like globalism and stuff like that. But it's a term that actually does have an academic meaning, but nobody uses it in an academic sense. Everybody uses it as a political crudgeon in order to basically beat their opponents over with and insult them, basically.
Well, it's interesting because they have turned it into like so let me put it this way. I understand people that are Zionists. I understand people who are not Zionists. I don't understand this whole idea that it is by definition like an evil or bad term. Like, it isn't.
That's what it's become, though. It's become, especially in the West, in academic circles, usually left-wing circles, but also certain elements of the right as well. It's used as an insult.
Yeah.
It's also tied in with, a lot of conspiracy theories about Semitism in general, the protocols of the elders of Zion and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, so you're mixing pure fantasy with academic, usually left-wing oriented criticisms of the Israeli people as occupiers and colonialists and stuff like that. Again, it gets into a lot of muddying the waters. But
well, this guy was back to, once again, this is genocide is what Israel is doing to Palestine, etc. Next one. Like, I feel like we've already addressed a lot of these. Here's what I want to do.
Even in our own chat, you've got a lot of anti-Semitism just blatant in the chat. Jews this, the Jews that. And it's like right now happening in our chat.
Yeah.
And I'm completely appalled that anti-Semitism is totally back in fashion.
Yeah.
Blaming the Jews for everything.
Well, and again, like I look at some of this and it is amazing to me how people cannot distinguish between two different things. It's like, oh, you believe that Israel, so you must support everything Israel does. No, let me make this really clear. I believe America should exist. That doesn't mean I support everything the American government or even the American people do. It doesn't mean I support everything that ever happened in our history. But it doesn't mean I think America should be wiped off the face of the planet as a result.
And that seems to be the solution.
Can that, I mean, so Khalid Peer came back and he said this. He goes, Nick, I understand your viewpoint and I respect it, but being pro-Palestinian is not being pro-Hamas. I appreciate that he said this. He goes, there is no Hamas in the West Bank and there was no Hamas in the Great March of Return, and Palestinians were still killed by the IDF. So yeah, crap on Hamas all you want, but please note many of us are pro-Palestinian, which does not mean pro-Hamas. Also, being pro-Palestinian does not make one anti-Jewish, but we do oppose Zionism. I hope this makes sense. Wait a second. It does make sense. Here's where I think the problem is. I appreciate that someone can be pro-Palestinian without being pro-Hamas. Now, what I will say is you're right. Hamas was not as prevalent in the West Bank, but the Palestine Liberation Organization was, and it also conducted terrorist attacks. So Hamas is not the only Palestinian organization which deliberately targets Israeli civilians. So this idea that, well, Hamas is not in the West Bank and IDF still killed people. So yeah, because there were other terrorist organizations in the West Bank. Now, does that mean that Israel always did everything correct? No, I'm not claiming that. But what I do want to do is dispossess this notion that, well, if Hamas wasn't there, then it must be that they were just attacking innocent Palestinians. The other thing that I will say is, it goes, I want to make way. I'm not anti-Jewish, but I do oppose Zionism. So this is the part that I think is frustrating. We just explained what Zionism is. Zionism, in its most basic terms, is the belief that the Jews should have a state, a Jewish state, in the Levant. But if you're saying you oppose Zionism, then I'm going to conclude that what you mean is that the current state of Israel should not exist. There should be no Jewish state in the Levant. That's the conclusion.
So to play devil's advocate for a second.
Go ahead.
Khalid here is using a definition of Zionism that you're not using. This is why what I was trying to say earlier. A lot of people have a definition of Zionism that is not the equivalent of what the definition that you were giving us a minute ago, Nick. Yeah. For some people, it's just like neoliberalism. Yeah. What neoliberalism is basically a soft form of, I believe in some form of free market and some form of global trade or globalism. Yeah. But what a lot of people use with the term neoliberalism is Joe Biden, or the Conservative Party in the UK right now with their leadership, Rishi Sunak and stuff like that. Like they will call these people neoliberals, and they will use it more as an insulting term without necessarily any sort of like academic specific language to define what that term means. For a lot of people, Zionism is not, I believe that the state of Israel has a right to exist. A lot of people equate Zionism with certain elements, and they do exist, certain elements of extreme nationalist sentiments. They're maybe not a huge majority, or maybe not even a majority itself, but there is an element of extreme nationalist sentiments, just like there are with almost any culture within Israel, that does want to like push the Palestinian people out and reclaim, these borders of like greater Israel. You get elements of this within many cultures. I mean, look at, the elements of like, there's an element of like Greek nationalists that's like, we need to make Constantinople Greek again, right? Like there's an element of Turkish nationalists that's like, we need to restore the Ottoman Empire.
But here's the problem is that Zionism does have a definition. Now, if people are using Zionism to then expand beyond, original interpretations or whatever else, feel free to critique it. But what I think is going on here is that people are now taking a word that had a definition, and they're now saying that any extreme interpretation of that definition is the definition.
Yes, that's the problem.
It's like, okay, if you're doing that, do we get to do that with the stuff that you're saying? Do we get to do that with the stuff that Palestinians are saying?
It's a fair point. All that I was trying to argue is that Zionism is one of these muddy terms.
Sure.
That, and it's a problem, right? Because words should have meaning. This is part of the issue that we're just dealing with in general with the clown world that we're living in
like
now.
They want to sweep
words
everything
don't
up
have
into
meaning,
it.
we've muddied the waters and what the meaning of original words are. And when we can't agree on language,
yes,
how can we agree on anything else?
So for instance, if Khalid was saying here that I'm not anti-Jewish, but he opposes Zionism, the next question, the relevant question here is, what do you mean by that? And I've got people here on the audience too going, again, the Caravaggio, a definition according to whom, Nick Freitas? You? No, it's not according to me. It's according to Vox. It's according to the Anti-Defamation League. It's according to
groups that we don't necessarily agree with.
Yeah, groups that I constantly disagree with. The University of Michigan. Like, all I can say is that if you want to provide, and here's the problem, you want to get mad at me like, oh, that's your definition, then provide an alternative. What's your alternative definition? And then provide me some basis, because I've actually read about Theodore Herzl. I've actually read about this period of Jewish history. I actually read about what the Jews agreed to in 1947. And so if you're going to say Zionism is something different, well, then instead of getting all pissy with me about my definition, provide a different one and tell me why yours is more accurate.
They're laughing at the fact that you said that, well, I got this definition from Vox and the ADL. They're like, LOL. I think you're missing the point that Nick is trying to make there, people. Nick is pulling a definition from several groups that we disagree with.
Yeah, it's not like I went to Israel, like the government of Israel website. And again, that's always very convenient, like, ha, ha, ha. Then provide a different one. Provide a different one, and then also provide justification for why your definition is better. And if you're not willing to do that, because you're getting yours from, I don't know, the Hamas website, well, then I'm done listening to you.
Does Hamas have a website?
I don't know.
Damon wants us to look up the State Department's definition of anti-Semitism, because the State Department apparently is the correct.
I guarantee you they're going to have some like the ADL came out in the last few days and was like, the level of white supremacist language in this country is like, at an astonishing all-time high. And it's like, people, do you have any idea who's marching in the streets saying gas the Jews? Yeah. They're not a bunch of skinhead,
no, they're not,
neo-Nazi extreme right-wingers out there. It's not the Pepe the Frog people that joke about how we need a fascist dictatorship that are out there saying this stuff. It's left-wing academics in universities that are coming out there saying
marchers
this.
holding up swastikas.
You know what? The ADL hates the right more than they love defending their supposed interest group that they're oriented towards defending. They will go down swinging as long as it's swinging against the right, even if it means doing nothing to actually defend Jews.
I agree. Caravaggio says, Nick Freitas, simplistic definitions aren't helpful. Here is my point. You know what's also not helpful? No definitions, right? Just using a term in order to give it some vague meaning so that you can use it as a slur against somebody else. And then when they try to actually go through, because I looked up 5 different definitions of Zionism, from sites I would probably be more inclined to agree with ideologically, and from sites I'm not inclined to agree with at all. And they all came back with a pretty similar definition. So I'm not trying to do something vague. I'm not trying to play a game here in order to improve my argument. And here's the thing. If you can prove to me right now that what Zionism means is that the Jewish state is going to slaughter and remove all the Palestinians, well, then I would oppose Zionism. I don't think that's what Zionism actually means. And if opposing Zionism, if Khalid means it, he doesn't specify. So I'm not going to assume for him or suggest that he means one thing versus something else. But if being anti-Zionist means that you do not believe Israel should exist, you do not believe that there should be a Jewish state in the Levant, then yes, I oppose that. I oppose that belief. I do believe that there should be a Jewish state within the Levant. I think that's perfectly justifiable. I think it's morally justifiable. I think it's historically justifiable. Now, do I believe that it should be done in such a way as to try to account for the interests of the various groups that have historically lived in this area for many centuries? Yes. But from what I've seen so far, I've seen the Jewish state agree to a partition in 1947. I've seen them come back to the negotiating table several times and agree with various partitions. And every single time it's been rejected. Now, if your argument is, well, the Palestinians shouldn't have to put up with anything less than the elimination of a Jewish state, I don't think that's a reasonable position. And you're probably not going to convince me otherwise for all the different historical reasons that we pointed out here. But that's the problem, is that if you don't like my definition, fine, provide what your definition is. But know this, whatever definition of Zionism you choose, here's my position, and I hope I've made it perfectly clear. I do believe that there should be a Jewish state within the Levant. We can talk about what the borders of that might look like. We can discuss what that might end up meaning for Jerusalem or for parts of the West Bank or for parts of Gaza. We can have all those discussions. But if your position is there should be no Jewish state, then you and I just simply disagree. There. All right, let's go to the next one. We got a couple more that we're going to hit on, and then I also want to watch some of these videos that somebody sent me, because I did have a very nice lady in the UK. I'm not going to share her name or whatnot because I didn't get permission to do that. But she came out and very earnestly just said, Nick, I disagree. Can I give you some other things to look at? And I said, sure. And we started having a conversation. All right. So Sabo says, so you're going to believe a country with one of the world's most sophisticated intelligence and spy networks was the victim of a surprise attack. Stage as hell. Another distraction. Until it's proven, I refuse to believe what's shown by any corporate media owned by BlackRock and a few. That's how we were fooled before with 9/11. Use your cognitive thinking ability, people, before reacting emotionally. Otherwise, the banking war machine will take more of us sons and fathers to slaughter once again in the name of freedom. Okay. Let's break this down. I don't know what you mean fooled by 9/11. I don't know if you believe that 9/11 was an inside job or a conspiracy or whatnot. Here's what I'll say. Do I believe that governments are capable of lying or facilitating conflicts in order to try to achieve greater stability at home? Yes, I believe they're capable of doing that. Do I believe that every conflict is a result of that happening? No, I do not. When it comes to, otherwise, the banking war machine will take more of our sons. Do I believe that there's such thing as a military-industrial complex which has interest with respect to the producing and selling of arms? Yes. Do I believe that can have a negative influence with respect to our participation in conflict? Absolutely. Do I believe that that is the reason for every conflict? No. This is the part that I don't get. Once upon a time, it was you had to just be cool with anything your country ever did to go to war, because that was the patriotic thing to do. Now it seems like the default position is I have to disagree with every single conflict because it's all just rich people in the background trying to get us all fighting with one another. I think both of those things are possible in any given situation. And I do think that we should scrutinize data to take a look at what happened. For instance, am I confused why Mossad didn't see this coming? Yes. But I've also read about the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where Mossad also missed that one coming. And I don't think they did it to play some sort of neat trick, because Moshe Dayan was actually trying to convince Golda Meir that they might have to agree on a negotiated settlement because they thought they were done. So this idea that sophisticated intelligence apparatus can't make mistakes, have you heard of the CIA? Or do you just think that everything they did was totally on purpose? No, I think people make mistakes. I don't think everything can be explained by nefarious intent. I think sometimes incompetence gets the best of governments. How do I know that? Because I've worked in the government. So I don't think we completely, negate that governments can be engaging in horribly self-serving, or particular administrations can be engaging in horribly self-serving actions. Okay, but I also don't think it explains everything either. I think if you're giving into one of those theories is the only thing that can explain everything, well then you've narrowed your entire your approach to analyzing data. Next one. We can start to jump ahead. Okay. This person this is just comical. This is just comical. This was a YouTube for anybody that is saying, well, Nick is just pro-Israel and this guy actually said you show the Palestinian perspective and even give it its own segment, but you don't show the Jewish perspective. I have to ask why that is, and I have to ask if that is because you don't care what it is. You see, it's not hard to find the Jewish perspective. This guy actually unsubscribed from my channel, right? Because they thought I didn't do anything to show the Jewish perspective. If you want to know how completely insane social media can get, this is it, right? This is it. The idea that we didn't.
You get hit from both sides.
Oh my gosh. And because some people really have gotten into this idea that if you are not exclusively dedicated to one side of a particular argument, then you're lukewarm or you're a bad guy or you don't care. The point that I've made through this whole time, and I've even said I have a bias toward Israel. Now, again, I believe that bias is actually rooted in some understanding of a history of the region and the history of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. Now, does that bias mean that I take on face value everything the Israeli government says? Absolutely not. All right, but because my default position is that the Jews do have a right to a state in the Levant, well, then a lot of other people just automatically disregard me as, well, you're just a pro-Israel Zionist. It's like, well, if by saying they have a right to exist and have a country in the law means that, well, then I guess to you that is exactly what I am. But I'm always willing to hear opposite perspectives on this. But what I don't like is this idea that the moment that you share an opposite perspective, that means you're endorsing the opposite perspective. That's not the case. Like, my gosh. All right, next one. Sorry, yeah, we're Hamilton's trying to go back and forth. And
I was joking in the chat and said, I have a bias towards the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Make the Holy Land great again. Baldwin 2024.
All right, so we had some people that did appreciate this. Said, thank you for your historical breakdown and your opinions, thoughts on potential outcomes. I do feel more aware of the situation now. Not saying that I fully understand all of what is going on, but definitely more knowledgeable on the topic now. Thanks, and thank you. It is we do appreciate when people appreciate what we do. We had some other people now too that have come in and asked if we would do more Q&As. We're going to try to get to more questions here. In fact,
I have so many questions that I've taken a note of.
Okay, all right. So we got some questions. Here's what we're going to do now. I think we've gone through enough of these. We got some videos I promised to go through because, again, very nice woman, pro-Palestinian, wanted to discuss some of these, and I want to hear what. I want to respect her take because, again, she was very respectful in the way that she addressed all of this. And I do want to respond to some of it.
Apparently you are a milquetoast fence sitter.
Just like Tim Pool, this person
just like
said.
Tim Pool.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
I think they're laughing. I think they did that tongue in cheek. There's a winky face.
There's
and
a
lots
winky
of smiley
face.
faces.
Okay.
I think it was a tongue in cheek comment. Okay, so you had some questions you've saved up?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get through the videos if that's okay.
Okay, yeah. So we're getting again, these videos were sent by somebody. Again, not going to share her name because she didn't give me permission to do that. But again, I felt she was trying to make an earnest argument for her position and her perspective, and so I wanted to. She sent me a ton of videos, so I can't get to all of them. But let's do this first one. So this is one that she sent to me from Noam Chomsky, and she said, one of the world's most respected intellectuals is a Jewish man speaking in support of Palestine. Go ahead and hit play on this.
Part of the tragedy of the Palestinians is that they have essentially no international support for a good reason. They don't have wealth, they don't have power, so they don't have rights. That's the way the world works. Your rights correspond to your power and your wealth. Same inside the United States. We shouldn't be surprised to see it. If you're a poor black kid in Roxbury, you don't have the rights of a rich person living in the suburbs, right? Same in the international arena. So the Palestinians, they may get, statements of support, but then nobody's going to do much for them, especially when the U.S. Threatens anyone who might try to do something. What's called the national interest turns out to be the interest of dominant domestic forces in U.S. society. So the national interest means the interests of the very rich major corporations, the ones who set government policy and so on. That's the national interest. They're not the population. The population is basically irrelevant. The population often strongly opposes government policy and they're simply disregarded. Overwhelmingly, people say there should be much higher taxes on the wealthy. What happens? Taxes on the wealthy go down.
Go ahead and pause there.
This is infuriating.
So this is the part where you're looking at something, and again, I'm going to say to the woman that sent me this, I appreciate these sentiments. This came from Al Jazeera. Noam Chomsky. Well, first of all, he's a linguist. That was his actual discipline within academia. But Noam Chomsky is like a straight up Marxist, right? Like
how could you say he's well respected, like universally?
Well, he is well respected in the field of linguistics, but when it comes to a lot of his other statements, like for instance, when he says, "Well, nobody supports the Palestinians," they just give statements. Are you out of your mind? Do you know how much money flows in to the Palestinian. In 2001 and 2022, the U.S. was the largest single donor to UNRWA, which is United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. Okay, contributing over $338 million in 2021 and $344 million in 2022. It received over $1.8 billion in donations in 2021 and over $1.17 billion in 2022 from various nations and organizations. We're talking about like year over year here. Billions of dollars is being raised and spent. And that's just through the United Nations. That is not the only relief organization going into the Palestinians. So this idea that it receives no international support, that is a lie. That is verifiably false. But like a lot of things Noam Chomsky says, if it fits within his narrative, and I would say he's an absolute believer in the Frankfurt School of power dynamics, right? When he's saying, oh, you don't have any freedom in the United States. You don't have any rights in the United States unless you're wealthy. I'm sorry, that's verifiably false.
We have an entire political movement dedicated to dividing people into oppressed and oppressor classes and then lifting up the identified oppressed at the expense of the oppressed. We have whole political movements, entire political movements dedicated to actively discriminating against people that they believe are oppressors and then actively discriminating in favor of people that they describe as being oppressed. This is how you get 100,000 people on the streets of London marching in support of Palestine. Don't tell me that the Palestinians don't have any support in the West. When you have 100,000 people marching in the streets days after 1,200 people have been butchered by Hamas coming out of the Gaza Strip, like this idea.
Christian, you're supposed to believe it because of all the dramatic music.
Wait, stop. I want to, because we got like 4 more of these to go to, and then we got a lot of questions. We got a lot of questions. But this is my problem, right? Like I understand that Noam Chomsky is Jewish. I understand that Noam Chomsky is an expert in the field of linguistics. Everything Noam Chomsky just said there is verifiably false. And so when he's held up as, well, look at what this Jewish man is saying about Palestine. I'm like, this is not, like, I'm just going to be honest with you. This is not a good argument for your case, because he's saying something that I know isn't true, that I can go right on right now and look up the actual numbers for United States aid that is going into this area. Like, I talked about the UN, the U.S. Agency for International Development. We're just talking about U.S. right now. We're not even talking about what the EU does. Provides financial support to the Palestinian people for various development and humanitarian projects. Since 1994, the United States has provided more than $5.2 billion in aid to Palestinians through U.S. aid. Right? Like we can go on and on and on, and we can look at what the EU donates. I mean, it's just. But no, Noam Chomsky gets to get up there and say this, and because it validates an impression or a desired position, well, then it has credibility. No, it only has credibility if it's true. I don't care that he's got multiple PhDs in linguistics. That doesn't make him a subject matter. Now, again, you could look at me and go, "What's your PhD in?" I don't got one. But again, I'm not asking you to trust me because Nick Freitas said it. I'm providing analysis of things that you can actually go and verify. Noam Chomsky just did the same thing. He provided analysis on things that I went and verified. And 5 seconds into verifying it, I can tell he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. But here's the important part, because this reveals something. Noam Chomsky using Palestine as an example of the whole power dynamic structure that he talks about, that comes out of the Frankfurt School, that's part of critical theory. This does more to explain why some people on the far left automatically and intuitively embrace Palestinians, even though if Hamas as a government took over, Noam Chomsky wouldn't be doing well. Right? It's because it doesn't matter as long as they fit within our established power dynamics, which is deliberately anti-capitalist, anti-West, well, then we'll embrace them. And then we'll say that nobody supports them. They have no power. And it's a very convenient narrative. It just doesn't happen to be true. All right.
Can we do a super chat real quick?
Let's do a super
From
chat.
Samuel, he says, how many congressmen are invested in or have relationships with Raytheon and Lockheed Martin? Should they be dictating foreign aid packages that are often washed and come right back to those companies they are cozy with?
I don't know how many, and here would be the difficulty in that, is because you have some people, like, so for instance, if you set up like a 401k, with a particular group, they might invest in 100 different companies as part of like an index fund or as a mutual fund or something like that. And Raytheon or Northrop Grumman or Boeing or something like that could be a part of like various blue chip stocks and things of that nature. And so the question is you have to ask yourself, okay, when are you allowed to invest versus when are you not allowed to invest? Like, am I not allowed to have any investments whatsoever if I'm in Congress, because I could potentially make a decision that would impact that company? I think that there have been some attempts, not sufficient attempts, but there's more where they're trying to come in and say, look, Congress people should not be allowed to like individually trade stocks. So for instance, you would still be allowed to buy like a popular index fund or mutual fund, but you don't get to go buy thousands of stocks in Raytheon or Northrop Grumman or Boeing or something like that right before you cast a deciding vote on whether
it's even worse than that.
Troops.
Buy options.
Yeah. That's even worse.
Nancy Pelosi did that all the time as Speaker of the House.
And the way they get around it is they don't buy the options until the information has been made public. The problem is that they knew everything that was going to happen, when it was going to happen, and at the exact moment it was going to happen. So the moment the vote is taken, now it's technically public information. They can do all their options at that point, and so they get in right at the ground level.
Well, I mean, the problem is that they know when it will become public.
Yes.
And so they know when to buy immediately after it becomes public. And so then somebody like Pelosi can buy hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of call options for a company right before they get a government contract. But then she can point out, well, it's a free market. I didn't do anything illegal. I only traded on publicly available information. Yeah, but you knew when it was going to become public before anybody else knew.
Yeah, and you knew what the outcome was going to be. Yeah, you didn't just know when it was going to become public. You knew what the outcome would be and when it would become public. All right, let's look at this next one.
Part 2 of questions you have about Palestine and Israel but are too afraid to ask. Let's go. What's the difference between Gaza and the West Bank? Okay, so if you missed our first video about Gaza, I've dropped it in the comments below, but just remember this. Gaza and the West Bank are separate territories belonging to Palestinians, but both are illegally occupied by Israel.
Pause.
Now, Gaza...
So once again, this is something of a problematic statement when you say they're illegally occupied by Israel. First of all, Israel doesn't occupy Gaza. It left in 2005. Israel does still have a presence in the West Bank, and there are people that have pushed for more settlements in the West Bank. The thing, I love this term illegal. When it comes to like these international.
Oops.
Oh, I got disconnected. 1 second.
Illegal.
Yeah, we have somebody that always complains about us messing with our mics, and
illegal,
it just happened.
Illegal when it comes to like occupying the West Bank. Was it illegal? Here's my question for anybody that's making this statement. Was it illegal when the Israelis accepted the UN partition of 47 and then all the Arab countries invaded? Was that illegal? Well, if you're going to use the same standard for international
No, that was
law,
decolonization.
See, there you go. Right? There you go. That was not illegal. Okay, was it illegal when the Arab states got together and were all threatening to invade Israel in 67? Was it illegal when the Arabs did invade in 73? Was any of that illegal? Or is it just okay when they do it, but not okay when Israel does?
Were the first and second intifadas legal or illegal? Like,
and look, I'm going to say this right now. If you go to war and you lose territory, I find it a little bit disingenuous to sit back and say, it's illegal that you're occupying this territory that you took from me in a war that I started.
Yeah. I'm going to invade you. You're going to take a little more ground, and I'm going to whine and complain till everybody makes you give it back.
I don't get this. Like, would the Palestinians care about would they care about the legality if they actually achieve what they say they want to achieve, which is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. So if you drove Israel into the ocean, would that be illegal? Or would that just be decolonization? So this is the part where, again, these terms end up getting used selectively, right, when it suits people's purposes. Go ahead and hit play again.
Used to be controlled by Israeli troops, but today it's just completely sealed off from the outside world.
Pause.
It's
completely sealed off from the outside world. Not from Egypt. It's not sealed off from Egypt. And let me ask you a question. If you left, does a country have a right to protect its borders? I would argue that they do. They do have a right to protect their borders. So why did Israel seal off its border with Gaza? It didn't seal off the Egyptian border with Gaza. Just sealed off the Israeli border. Perfectly allowed to do that. Perfectly allowed to do that. Play.
Restricts what goes in and out and also prevents most people from leaving. But
Pause.
Palestinians...
Not from Egypt. Again, Israel is doing all this as if Israel controls everything that goes on with Gaza. It doesn't. Does it have a significant amount of control with respect to its border? Yep. Israel's border. It sure does. And why wouldn't it when Hamas has a charter that is dedicated? If Mexico had written into its constitution that Mexicans had an obligation to kill Americans in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California because those were occupied lands, I'm pretty sure we would seal our border and probably restrict the sort of interactions, overland interactions we had with Mexico.
Is that all that it would take for us to finally secure the southern border? Because Mexico, please.
Yeah.
No harm, no foul. You can write that into your constitution if that encourages us to actually secure our borders. For once.
Okay, go ahead and play again.
There's a super chat that I guess we should get to it after.
We have a couple. Let's get through this video.
Okay.
In the West Bank live under direct military rule, while Israel systematically demolishes their homes and wipes out entire communities to build illegal settlements. What are settlements? Any Jewish person from anywhere in the world who's never even visited Israel can move there, become a citizen, and live in one of these Jewish-only settlements built on stolen Palestinian.
Pause. Again, the part that makes it very difficult, she could be making a decent argument with respect to settlements. She doesn't want to, because everything that she does within her language is rooted in this idea of illegal, stolen, and it's like, okay, but you're not even getting to the other side of this, which was none of this had to happen. None of this had to happen. If the Arabs would have said, we're going to accept the 47 part, we don't like all of it, but we want peace. We're going to have a Palestinian state, because the West Bank was part of the original Palestinian state. Well, and then Jordan. So it was all there. So what happened? Well, you kept threatening the extinction of Israel, and Israel was terrified that you were actually going to make good on it. And it was surrounded by a bunch of militaries that, at least on paper, were more powerful than its own. So you had a war in 67 and you lost. And then you came back in 73 and you actually made really, really good headway, and then you lost. And so now Israel's like, you know what? We're not going to we're not just going to give up the West Bank anymore. We're not going to do that. Because one, again, if you go back to the history of this part of the region, portions of the West Bank were very clearly a part of the ancient kingdom of Israel and then Israel and Judea. Now, you could argue that's ancient, Nick. It doesn't matter. Okay, fine. If you want to make that argument, fine. But that's their argument. But once again, it's always couched in this language of this is stolen land. If you fight an aggressive war and you lose land as a result, it's a little bit disingenuous for you to come back later and say, well, we were trying to steal your land, but we failed, and then you stole ours.
Somebody needs to tell the Germans that they can use that argument to get back, East Prussia, Posen, and Pomerania.
Yeah.
And Silesia. And Alsace-Lorraine, for that matter.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the problem with blood and soil arguments that left-wing
selectively
political activists use. And it gets to that contradiction that I've talked about, I think, in our first episode on Israel and Gaza, that ultimately you're seeing the same people that 4 years ago were telling us no immigrant is illegal, are now parroting Nazi-style blood and soil arguments for stolen and occupied and claimed and colonized land.
Yeah.
Which one is it?
Yeah.
Well, it seems like a contradiction, and it is a contradiction, but it's a contradiction that quite frankly, it doesn't matter if we point it out. This is hypocritical. This is a contradiction, because ultimately what these people are advocating for is not to rectify some sort of injustice that they've identified in the past, real or fake. It's to seek political power.
Well, let's look at.
That's what the point of all of this is.
We've got a couple more videos up here. I want to go through them a little bit quicker, and then we're going to just dedicate the whole rest of the show to questions. So let's click on another one of these. Okay.
Give me one moment here to get it restarted. It's going to get there. There we go.
We know what genocide looks like, and we know what the beginnings of genocide look like. We've seen this before, and we're seeing it right now live in real time, and it's horrific. We American Jews have been out in the streets, and many of us putting our bodies and freedom on the line. There were 400 at least 400 arrested yesterday in Congress saying, not in our name. And we need a ceasefire immediately. Apartheid and genocide are not Jewish values.
Pause. So again, this is another video that was sent to me. Very nice woman trying to show me that, see, look, and again, it's from Al Jazeera, but Al Jazeera is the news source. They're sharing what this woman had to say. She's an Jewish American peace activist. Ariel Lace Gold says many Jews in the U.S. are outraged over Israel's bombardment of Gaza. That is no doubt true. That is no doubt true that many Jews in America are mad at this. But once again, what's the term she's using? Apartheid, genocide. And it's like, look, I'm sorry, but once again, we're using hyperbolic language. It doesn't accurately describe what is going on because we have historical examples of these things, and this isn't it. But if you insist on using it, I'm going to insist. I'm automatically suspect of your claims at this point. Let's look at this one.
I'm heading with my family and the 2 other families that were staying with us in Khan Yunis. We're heading now to Gaza. We're going back to our apartments in Tel El Hawa neighborhood. Now, I know that it's not safe at all.
All right, pause it right now. Okay, I understand that this woman wants to go back to Gaza, right? Like, here's the quote she says: "At least if we're going to die with dignity in our homes." Al Jazeera's Yuma Assad filmed her family's journey back to the home in Gaza City after heeding Israel's warning for people to leave the area. Okay, so I want to point something out here. So she left, right? Israel said, look, we're going to attack. We're going to go in. We're going to go after Hamas. You need to leave the area. She did. So apparently it's possible. It's possible to leave the area that's going to be attacked. We were told it wasn't, but apparently it is. And now she's going back. So she knows Israel's going to go in there on the ground, and she's choosing to go back. And if she gets hurt, undoubtedly Israel will be blamed for it. So I want you to think, how would you feel if an American said, I know I was told to leave because a hurricane's coming, but screw that, I'm staying. And then all of a sudden they lost their heart, they get hurt. You would be like, you know what? I'm sorry that person got hurt, but they had every warning that something was coming and they chose to stay. This is part of the problem that I have with this idea that, well, you know, Israel is to blame for this. If you had told a bunch of Israelis living in those kibbutz, Hamas is coming to actively attack you in an aggressive act, not even a defensive response, coming to attack you, right? And people decided to, well, I'm gonna stay and protect it still wouldn't be a morally equivalent condition. But typically what we would see is the Israelis evacuate those areas and bring in military troops to defend it. And this is the part where, again, I'm looking at this going, okay, you're choosing to put yourself in harm's way. I understand that maybe that's a principled stance that you want to take, but I also think it's a little bit different than if you were just sitting there and all of a sudden a bomb hit your home for no reason. And let's do this last video. Okay. So this is apparently a doctor in Gaza struggled to contain her emotion as she spoke of the devastating scenes in her hospital due to Israel's bombardment and blockade, and gave a desperate appeal for the world to listen. Okay, completely understand where she's coming at as a position. She is a doctor, and she's just trying to save lives, and she's probably completely overwhelmed with what's going on in a war zone. I completely understand that. What I would like to know, though, is that does Hamas bear any responsibility for this, or do we now live in a world where one side is allowed to come in and indiscriminately attack you, and when you come in and counterattack, everything's supposed to stop? Everything's supposed to stop. Everyone's supposed to put down their arm. No, you're not allowed to. We can attack you as much as we want, but if you counterattack, you have to stop because people might suffer. Especially when, once again, we've already seen Hamas, and Hamas is not hiding the ball. They have come right out and said they've encouraged people to stay in position. They have placed legitimate military targets in close proximity to hospitals, in close proximity to schools, in close proximity to mosques. They've done it deliberately. And what I don't understand for the life of me is that if you're going to say, Nick, I don't care about, if you're going to say, Nick, regardless, Israel still shouldn't be doing that. Should you at least also have some degree of frustration or animosity or contempt for Hamas, who initiated the attacks and then voluntarily chose to place legitimate military targets within close proximity of civilian targets. But no, I'm just, because people are looking at me going, Nick, how can you look at this poor doctor in Palestine making this appeal and not feel anything? It's not that I don't feel anything. It's that I don't think we're properly assigning responsibility to some of this. Well, if Israel had did Israel just sit by and attack suddenly one day because they felt like it? Is that what happened? No, it is not. They gave notice. The journalist who, again, part of the problem with this is people will send me a clip saying, see, look. And I'll say, okay, but now let's analyze it within context. If you're telling me that the people can't flee and then you have someone that said, hey, I fled, I got out of there, but now I'm going back because I'm going to die with dignity in my house. Well, now you don't get to tell me that it's impossible for people to flee. Right? If you're going to tell me that you are lamenting civilian casualties in Gaza, I'm going to ask then, okay, are you going to hold Hamas accountable for the deliberate actions that they take in order to put those civilians in danger? Do they bear any responsibility, or is it all Israel? If you say it's Israel and Gaza, okay, I might disagree on some level, but I would at least respect that as being intellectually consistent. If you say no, just Israel's fault, I'm sorry, I no longer respect you as being intellectually consistent. And it's very, very difficult for me to take your position seriously when you're not willing to actually accept that context within this situation, within this problem. All right, let's go ahead and I know we got some other videos here, but we've been doing this for a while and I want to get to some questions because we're already coming up at the 2-hour mark. So let's go.
We have a couple super chats that we can get to first, and then I've got a whole list of questions here. This one is from Spastic Jellyfish. What do they do with all the funding? Desalination, so they don't need Israeli water? No, they grow their country. No, what do they do with it? And I think he's talking about the funding that goes to Palestine. Yeah, no, this is kind of always been one of the big questions, right? Is all this funding goes in to aid the Palestinians. And again, you got funding going to the West Bank and you got funding going to Gaza. And yeah, there's a lot of things that they could do in Gaza that would improve the general life of their population with respect to education, with respect to infrastructure construction, with respect to things like, potentially desalination plants that would help. They could do some things with respect to power generation, all of these things. But instead, they use an inordinate amount of that aid money to go toward weapons, to go toward other things. And then they end up relying on Israel for water and power, which Israel provides, by the way. And then all of a sudden they launch a massive attack. And then when Israel cuts off the water and the electricity, Israel gets hammered for causing a humanitarian crisis. So let me get this straight. Is your narrative, honestly, is your honest position is that Israel should be attacked from a place it's providing water and power to and not cut off the water and power? It should just continue to provide it regardless of what's happening to it. I don't know. I don't think I know a single other person that would accept that if they were the ones paying the price for it. They would not accept that. But Israel's supposed to. And again, it partially it's because I think people have bought into this idea that Israel's engaged. They're an apartheid state, colonizers, oppressors, committing genocide, committing ethnic cleansing. I think we've explained, I think we've at least sufficiently explained that, no, that's not an accurate representation of what Israel has done. You can still disagree with Israel. You can still disagree with some of its policies. You can still want Israel maybe to go back to certain lines. But if you're going to tell me you just don't want Israel to exist, well, then this becomes a really easy argument. You just don't want Israel to exist. And nothing Israel does. Israel could sit there and it could just get pounded by rocket attacks relentlessly. And you would still expect it to provide water and power and aid and everything else until it ceased to exist. And if that's an acceptable solution for you, I'm afraid that I don't think that there's going to be any common ground between the two of us. All right. This super chat is from LS. Sir, why are we even trying to stick our nose in the Middle East again? It wasn't 20 years with nothing to show for it. Enough. I'm so sick of Americans being sent to who cares a stand for nothing.
Well, here's what I would say. I think some of the reason, and again, let me look at this from a couple different perspectives, because what I'm trying to do is answer your question, not necessarily endorse one of the answers. Okay. One question is because obviously there is a large population within the United States that for a variety of religious reasons supports Israel and the existence of an Israeli state, and therefore wants to provide it some level of support. And that varies greatly based off of again, someone's religious beliefs, et cetera. So there's some people that think that the United States should support Israel at all costs. There's other people that support the existence of an Israeli state that don't necessarily believe that the United States has an obligation to maybe prop up or protect it. So you'll notice in this whole thing, I have not advocated for the United States sending ground troops into Israel. I haven't advocated for that. I had somebody insinuate that I was, and if I advocate for ground troops going in somewhere, you know what I'll say? I'll say, I think we should send ground troops into there, right? And I've never done that. So I don't believe that the United States necessarily has a moral obligation to, personally defend Israel. I understand people that have certain convictions about that. So I think that's why a lot of people are interested in this part of the world. Some people would also say that we have a long-term, kind of allegiances to the area. During the Cold War, there was a lot of Middle Eastern countries that sided with the Soviet Union. Israel sided with the United States. So I think for a number of reasons, both strategic and perhaps theological, is why many Americans and maybe other people within European countries are interested in the conflict in Israel. I think another reason why they're interested in it is because obviously it's something of a strategic place on the map. And that's been true of centuries. And then when you also look at the close proximity with respect to oil and everything else, that also adds a strategic concern with the area. Because so much of the world's oil flows through this part of the world, there's always going to be, significant great powers are always going to be interested in that. And so that's why I think that there's an interest. Again, I'm not endorsing, sending U.S. troops into Israel. I'm not suggesting that. But I mean, to answer, but yeah, I think the United States needs to be a lot more cautious in our foreign entanglements. I think we need to be, again, I'm not a fan of nation building. I fought in Iraq. That doesn't mean I think we did a good job. I had a lot of friends that fought in Afghanistan who don't think we did a good job. I think there's a significant difference between the United States launching punitive actions against, terrorist targets versus the United States engaging in complete nation building. And so I do think we need to be a little more careful. And I also think that before we ever get involved in a major conflict again, Congress better do its job and actually vote on it instead of just leaving it up to the executive branch.
This last super chat is from Samuel. He says, should young men be concerned with carrier groups in the Middle East having a Gulf of Tonkin incident, considering our government has a history of creating reasons to go to war?
I think that's totally fair. Yeah. So there's two ways to look at this. You could say that U.S. military presence can it have the ability to act as a deterrent for a larger conflict? That's one of the arguments being made. Again, I'm not endorsing this argument. I'm saying it's an argument that's made that if the United States demonstrates a certain degree of asserting its influence in the area, will that potentially prevent a wider conflict? And the answer is, yeah, that's possible, right? So for instance, people always look back and do what ifs when it comes to World War I and especially World War II. What if, European powers would have more, forcefully asserted themselves when Nazi Germany started engaging in aggressive actions with respect to,
Austria, the Sudetenland,
the Sudetenland,
the Rhineland,
the Sudetenland and the Rhineland were the ones I was thinking about. Had France or the UK stood up more forcefully at that point and said, "We're going to engage militarily if you continue to do this," could it have prevented a wider conflict? And the answer is we don't know. Right? There's so many different conditions that need to be met and catalysts that need to be met. But the argument in favor of the U.S. military presence is that it will prevent a wider conflict. The argument against the U.S. presence is, just like you said, Gulf of Tonkin, right? It ends up becoming an excuse for the U.S. military gets hit. Somebody launches a missile. We can't properly identify where it came from, and now it's used as greater justification to increase military presence and troop presence. And I think that is absolutely a legitimate concern. If you're an American right now, if you're in the military, that is something that you're thinking about, and you have every right to be concerned about it. Because I do believe that if a U.S. carrier was hit, and we couldn't properly identify where it was coming from, it could potentially cause a certain degree of escalation. I don't know to what degree, but yeah, it's a legitimate concern.
All right. We've got a long list of questions that I've gathered from the chat. We're going to get right through them as fast as we can, hopefully get to as many as we can. This one says, why do Americans feel such an urge to pick a side in a conflict that doesn't invoke them? I just have such a hard time getting through each day with regular life to be protesting all day.
No, I think
you
that's
kind of answered that in the previous.
Yeah, well, and just conflicts in general. I think one, the United States is the world's major superpower, and so our involvement or our picking a side in a potential conflict has massive implications for how the conflict could potentially go. I think you're right. I think we are a little bit too concerned with getting ourselves involved in every conflict. But then you also see situations where people come back later, and the same people that don't want us involved will later on say, well, if only you had been involved in this one. You saw this with the Hutus and the Tutsis, with Rwanda. We got involved in Kosovo. We didn't get involved in Rwanda, and there was different arguments given for why we did that. And some people claimed it was racism and other things. So I think people are curious because we have such vast economic and military power. I think it's also interesting, and I don't think it's unusual, and I don't think it's just Americans. It's unusual for individual Americans to potentially feel greater affinity for one side in a particular conflict. The question is what sort of obligation does that actually push on our government? And I would like people to take a position where, look, if you're going to decide to opine on a particular conflict, that's fine. You can do that as an individual. Maybe you can donate your own money if you feel like people are suffering or you want one side to win the conflict. Or, hey, you can always get on a plane, fly out there, grab your passport and go fight if you want. Americans actually did that at the beginning of World War II when FDR said we weren't going to get involved. You had Americans join the Canadian military and Americans join the British Air Service.
You had some American pilots in the RAF.
Yeah. So you can always do that. The problem, I think, is when people go from, because I think this, therefore the United States government should have an obligation to involve itself and send other people to war. That's where I have a little bit more of a problem with this, right? You can always, I think it is a proud thing when people are willing to stand and put themselves in personal danger for the conviction. I don't think it's as honorable when they're so hot and heavy to put everybody else in danger for their convictions. And that's one of the biggest problems I have with a lot of American activism is it seems really, really brave as long as they're not the ones going to fight.
Next question. If groups of illegals in America were to attack an area similar to what happened in Israel, would these people who support terrorism feel the same?
I mean, I imagine they wouldn't. But I don't know. I think it depends on whether or not they would get attacked. One of the fascinating things that we saw on Twitter was a lot of people were and it was liberals. It was leftists fighting with liberals. The liberals were essentially saying, whoa, wait a second. I may not like the state of Israel, but I don't think Hamas going in and murdering a bunch of innocent people is a good idea. And are you honestly saying that they can do this in the name of decolonization? And you actually had a lot of leftists go on there and say, yeah, it would suck, but yeah, the Navajo have every right to kill me in my bed and take back their land.
Oh, you had other people that didn't even say, yeah, that would suck. You had other people just straight up say yes.
It just is what it is, man.
Yeah.
That's the way it is.
That right there is just telegraphing their intention, their violent intentions towards you.
Yeah.
Not even their fellow liberals, like towards you, the audience.
Yeah.
Those people are dangerous.
Yeah.
And they've taken over our universities, unfortunately.
Bjorn asked a good question. What do you guys think about the massive criticism Israel gets for not giving up the higher ground, West Bank, to their adversaries?
Why should they give it up? They conquered it.
Well, and that's kind of the issue. Let me put it this way. You know what also Israel conquered? The Sinai Peninsula. Does it belong to Israel now? No, it belongs to Egypt. So what were the conditions necessary for Egypt to get the Sinai Peninsula back? They signed a peace treaty. Egypt recognized Israel's right to exist. All right, so here's my question. Has the PLO or Hamas agreed to anything that would recognize Israel's rights to exist?
I could be wrong, but I do believe the PLO has, because for a long time, the PLO was also basically a terrorist organization. But I do think that the PLO has tried to some degree to form some sort of peace negotiation with Israel. But it's worth pointing out in the late 90s, Bill Clinton tried to have some negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And Yasser Arafat was given arguably a fantastic deal.
Yeah.
Israel would have recognized Gaza as being Palestinian-controlled territory. They would have recognized the West Bank, by the way, of being Gaza-controlled territory. They would have allowed the Palestinians to have East Jerusalem as their capital under Palestinian control, and they would have given them custodianship over the mosque that sits on the Temple Mount. Sorry, it's actually not a mosque. I believe it's a shrine. Technically,
are you talking about the Al-Aqsa Mosque?
No, the Temple Mount, which is technically not a mosque. I believe that's a shrine. But there were some other stipulations there. But Israel was prepared to recognize Palestine as an independent nation with its own territory, its own government, its own police force, its own military, its own, legislature, all that stuff, with shared control over Jerusalem, by the way.
Yeah.
And Yasser Arafat said no. And Clinton's response was, what? You're dooming your people by saying no. And he said no. And that was the end of the negotiations right there. Every time, this has happened over and over again. The Jews accepted the 1947 agreement that the UN proposed.
Yeah.
And the Palestinians said no to that. Like, how many times do the Palestinians government recognized, officials have to reject peace offers before eventually we come back and we say, maybe we should start asking questions of why one side in this party continuously refuses to come to the table in good faith.
Well, in 93, Yasser Arafat, they did say the PLO recognizes the right of the state of Israel to exist in peace and security. Right. The problem was they didn't really make good on it. And I want to say I think it was as late as 1999 or maybe 2000. I think it was right around there where you had Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat. And they had I think it was the Camp David Accords, where Israel was giving.
You mean Bill Clinton, not Barack Obama.
Sorry, yeah, Bill Clinton. Sorry, where Ehud Barak gave in to almost all of the PLO.
You just said Barack.
Sorry, Bill Clinton. I said Ehud Barak.
I see.
Ehud Barak was the
That's
prime minister. Okay. Ehud Barak was the prime minister of Israel.
See, I'm the idiot now, not you.
and they gave in to most of Yasser Arafat's. So keep in mind, even though Yasser Arafat recognized the right of Israel to exist, that doesn't mean they stopped engaging in attacks, right? So that was kind of the issue here. All right, what's the next question? But all of that to say that I think Israel has demonstrated that they have been willing to give up territory in the past if it actually secures peace. The problem is that, with the exception of perhaps Egypt and maybe Jordan, it really hasn't. And so they're certainly not willing to give up the Golan Heights to Syria. They're certainly not willing to, I think, completely give up the West Bank just because it's so central to both their history and from a strategic perspective. From a strategic perspective, you can actually secure Gaza. You can secure your border with Gaza. Securing the border with West Bank would be impossible.
I mean, technically, Israel did secure it in 1967. They took it from the Jordanians.
No, I'm saying that it would be impossible to maintain a border security wall that elaborate in perpetuity. I just don't. That's what I'm saying.
Well, that's part of the reason that Israel occupies it. But again, they have in the past, though, and to end this question, in the past, though, they have offered to hand over the West Bank to the Palestinians in exchange for peace.
I think the majority of it. I don't think all aspects of it.
That's true.
And there was negotiated settlements with respect to Jerusalem and East Jerusalem. Anyway, let's go on to the next one.
All right, we got a question from RB here. Other than an all-out war to end Middle East wars, is there anything that would lead to peace in the Middle East?
The Palestinians finally come to the table in good faith. That would...
There was a quote that I think Netanyahu said once where he said, basically I'm paraphrasing, but it was like if the Palestinians put down their weapons, there'd be peace in the Middle East. If the Israelis put down their weapons, there would be no Israel. And I think it's kind of hard to argue with that logic. Now, that doesn't mean that Palestinians have to agree with everything Israel wants for a peace settlement. But if you're asking what would lead to peace, I think if the Palestinians were willing to accept, and perhaps an independent Gaza, and independent portions of the West Bank and some sort of agreement with respect to East Jerusalem, I think you probably have as much peace as you can expect to have in that particular part of the area. I don't think every terrorist organization puts down their arms, but I think it would lead to certainly greater peace. But I also believe that there is enough terrorist groups, and then you also have Iran, which are absolutely committed to the destruction of Israel to a point where they're not interested in peace. They're just not interested in it. It's not important to them. More so than getting rid of Israel. And so to that degree, I think it becomes incredibly hard to achieve it. It's one of the reasons why, Israel has sought out nuclear weapons and has spent a great deal of money on defense. And it's also one of the reasons why they've built close ties with the United States.
Next question here. Is it wise for outsiders to involve themselves in intergenerational ethno-religious blood feuds? Does it ever help?
That's a really good question.
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean. Like, so for instance, If you had now obviously when you say, is it wise? Wise for what? Is it wise for your own peace of mind and well-being? Maybe not. But if you were witnessing one group of people slaughtering, butchering, and murdering another group of people, the question is could you sit there and just watch it? Especially if you thought you had some sort of ability to intervene, right? This is one of the areas where I sometimes get in trouble with my libertarian friends. And it's because I don't think the United States has a moral obligation to involve itself in every single conflict, even ones that might be really, really bad. But by the same token, I think we should at least be honest about what we're talking about. So again, I'm not advocating that the United States is responsible for Israel's security. I'm not suggesting that. I do think that Israel has a right to exist. And I do think it's generally problematic when you're getting yourself involved in generational ethno-religious blood feuds. But if you're asking me, is there no condition, or is there no circumstance where it's ever appropriate? I'm not willing to commit to that answer. I think it's fair to say that you should probably be very careful in what you're engaging in, because you're probably not going to solve anything by simply, achieving, or you're simply not going to solve anything by pushing your weight around and then leaving again. The question is how does that end? Does that end with one side just killing the other? Or does it end with both sides compromising and agreeing to peacefully coexist on some terms? I think what's been demonstrated in the last couple of years, though, Egypt came to the table, Jordan came to the table, Saudi Arabia was looking at coming to the table. You saw more and more Arab countries lining up to come to the table with respect to Israel on this. Now, here's my question. Could any of that been achieved without U.S. military or without U.S. involvement?
Probably not.
Probably not. So the question in that thing is, are there ever times where it's okay? Again,
keep in mind involvement in this case, like with the peace negotiations where the UAE, I believe in 2020, opened up relations with Israel. Yeah. It was the U.S. that brokered that deal. It wasn't like the U.S. was playing a military role in that. They were simply being the go-between to allow for negotiations between Israel and the UAE to take place. That's a positive example of us working towards peace that I don't think is necessarily something that I would say I'm against. And I'm somebody that has come out many, many times and say, I don't think we should be involved in any of this as much as possible. But that doesn't mean that I don't think that the U.S. can play a positive role when it comes to negotiating a peace settlement where one is physically possible to be negotiated.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conditions that have to look at that. But to your point, you certainly should not just rush in there thinking, oh, don't worry, I've got this. When you're, a country as young as the United States getting involved in, again, a centuries-old blood feud. I mean, that's somewhat problematic. I want to point to another question here, because somebody asked this, and I don't know if we got to it, but they've asked it twice. Jack, the All-Seeing-Eye, said, question, again, two-state solution. Like, is there such a thing as a two-state solution? Again, in 1947, that's what the UN thought the solution was. The Arabs disagreed. The Israelis agreed to a two-state solution. Again, I think, or like in principle, they've agreed to it for a while. They've also actually put it down on paper and agreed to it. It's largely been organizations like Hamas that don't. So the real question is, a two-state solution only works if the Palestinians decide, okay, that's it. We're now going to move into peaceful coexistence. Maybe we don't love one another, but we're not going to attack one another, and we're going to respect one another's borders and right to exist. I think if you could get that, I think that would be the closest you would come to some sort of like long-lasting peace in that area. But again, part of the problem with that too is that's also going to take the way that's a political solution, but you're going to need a cultural solution to actually make that political solution possible and sustainable. So if, for instance, if you're still teaching kids in Gaza that it's okay to be a suicide bomber as long as you're killing Jews, or if you're still teaching that all of this land is occupied and stolen, well, then you're creating future generations of people that are going to say, I don't care what peace treaty my dad signed, I'm going to fight. So that's really what it needs. Is it's not just you can't just have a political solution. There has to be enough cultural weight behind it to actually accept it in order to make it work.
This question is from Andrew. Don't Palestinians have a responsibility to resist/overthrow Hamas? As Americans, we believe that we are directly responsible for the regime over us. Aren't they tolerating Hamas?
I mean, they're not just tolerating it, they voted for it. Now, again, Hamas won with a plurality, so I don't want to suggest that there was no opposition to Hamas and no strong opposition to Hamas. I think if you got a different government in there, you would probably get different results. I think that's partially what Israel's trying to achieve. Time will tell on whether or not that's actually going to be feasible. But yeah, you do. Look, here's one of the rules with democracy, right? If you're going to advocate for democracy, well, then the people voting for a particular type of government do bear some responsibility for that government. Again, as I said before, I don't think they bear responsibility for every individual decision that government makes, but they do bear some responsibility. And what you see in a lot of polling coming out of Palestine is that there is still very widespread support for Hamas. And this is one of the things that I think angers a lot of people on one side of this, is that it's all fine and good to say, okay, I support the Palestinians, but I don't support Hamas. But when you have a significant amount of the population supporting Hamas, that's obviously problematic. And that's what I went to before. Like, you can have all the political solutions you want. If there isn't sufficient cultural push to actually make that political solution last, it isn't going to.
This is also why it's a bit uncomfortable to bring this up, but like, this is why Egypt has the border with Gaza closed. Because the Egyptian government, last time we checked, run by Arabs, a overwhelming majority Islamic country, has concluded that the people of Gaza, 2 million people or so, obviously not all of them, but a huge chunk of them have been so radicalized that allowing them into Egypt would destabilize Egypt. And they've concluded that not without cause.
Are you talking about the next question?
Yes. Is it possible that Egypt keeps its borders closed with Gaza to prevent Hamas members from mixing with the population trying to leave? So the reason that Egypt has the borders with Egypt, Arab country, Islamic country, you would, somebody in America or the West might think, why doesn't Egypt open their borders with Gaza? Aren't they basically the same people? Egypt does not want to open its borders with Gaza because the Egyptian government has concluded that a majority, or at least a significant plurality of the people in Gaza have been radicalized to the point that if they were allowed into Egypt, they would destabilize Egypt. And they've concluded that not without cause. For example, in Kuwait, there used to be 200,000 Palestinians. I believe actually 400,000 Palestinians. I might have that wrong, though. I know it was at least 200,000 Palestinians lived in Kuwait until 1991. The Kuwaiti government kicked them out of Kuwait because they were destabilizing the government. There's this thing called Black September that took place in Jordan, I believe 1970. There was a large, like in the millions of Palestinian refugees, quote unquote refugees, that were living in Jordan after the 6-Day War. And guess what? The organizations that were operating within that community were extremely radicalized versions of Islam, basically almost like Wahhabist types. And they were destabilizing the Jordanian government to the point that they were trying to assassinate political figures within Jordan. There was, I believe, an attempt on the king of Jordan's life, and also an attempt on members of his government, like his prime minister and some of his cabinet officials, from Palestinian militants living within Jordan. The response from the Jordanian government was literally to wage war against these groups that were operating within Jordan and expel them from the country. And guess where they went after they left Jordan? They went to Lebanon. And guess what they did in Lebanon? They joined the civil war that was going on in Lebanon, overthrew the right-wing Maronite Christian government that was ruling Lebanon, and installed a left. This is shocker. They allied themselves with the political left. They allied themselves with socialists and Marxists, and they allied themselves with organizations that eventually became Hezbollah, which is a political Islamicist pro-radical Palestinian organization in Lebanon that is closely allied with Hamas. And so we have example after example. We have 3 examples of majority Arab, majority Islamic countries, with one exception being Lebanon, which is 50% Muslim, 50% Christian. We have 3 examples of countries that accepted significant numbers of Palestinian refugees. And guess what happened? Their governments were extremely destabilized. They were plunged into civil war, or they were almost plunged into civil war, and they had political members of their government be assassinated or attempted assassinations against them, to the point that those governments, again, Arab and Islamic governments, decided we need to kick these people out of our country because they've become too radicalized and they're destabilizing our societies. At some point, individual responsibility is a thing, and you can't say they're just a victim of most socioeconomic factors. When you have millions of Palestinian people be so radicalized as to the point that Arab countries don't want them, you need to start questioning, what exactly are they teaching the next generation of Palestinian people in places like Gaza? Because it's getting to the point where countries like Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, they don't want those people. And so then you have to ask why.
There's close ties between Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, too. And the Muslim Brotherhood has been a huge problem within Egypt. And so, yeah, if you're to prevent Hamas members mixing with the population trying to leave, I think there's certain like just basic economic reasons. There's also security reasons, and I think Christian articulated them pretty well. Dana Jones asked, would it be more effective to engage the governments, countries financing, equipping, training terrorist groups? Well, here's the issue. Iran is directly financing terrorism and terrorist operations, but a lot of the money that's coming in to like Gaza is coming in from the EU. It's coming in from the United States. It's earmarked for certain things, and then it gets used for other things. So the real question is okay, how do you, if you want to help the Palestinian people, how do you do so in such a way to where money and resources not getting reallocated for military purposes? And really the only way to do something like that is that if you're actually providing goods and services as opposed to like pallets of cash. And even then though, the problem is that if you give goods, they can always take the goods and sell them for something else. This is one of the reasons why it's been joked before that foreign aid is a transfer of wealth from poor people in rich countries to rich people in poor countries. Because even if you are just dropping off food, we saw this all over, we saw this in Africa a lot. Okay, you're dropping off food because you want to give pallets of cash. Okay, great. The warlords take the food and then they use it as leverage against the population. So this is kind of the problems with Hamas being in charge in Gaza. And it is part of the reason why the situation is certainly not wonderful, but different in the West Bank than it is in Gaza.
All right. This question is from JSolar590. How do the Palestinians defend themselves from the Israelis when the Palestinians do not have a standing military?
Well, they do have a standing military. It's just nowhere near on the same level as the Israelis. And I had somebody point this out to me. It's like, oh, it's fine and good when the Palestinians launch a strike into Israel with, people on motorbikes, and then Israel comes in with a tank. Okay, well, there's an easy way to not get invaded with a tank. Don't invade with a mini bike, right? If the way you conduct military operations is with a couple of guys with machine guns in the back of a Toyota Hilux, all right, that doesn't mean that the only way I can respond is with a couple of my guys in a Toyota Hilux. The reason why we develop strong military capabilities in the United States is not so we can fight fair if all of a sudden you hit us. No, we're coming with everything. And that's the way this works. So the best way for Hamas to avoid getting attacked by Israel is to not initiate attacks by Israel. But if Hamas is going to carry on, again, Hamas's position is Israel is an occupying force, and so they're going to attack them. Okay, well then you're going to get attacked by the Israeli military. I don't know what to tell you. If somebody breaks in my house with a knife and what they want to do is stab my family, I'm going to shoot them with a gun. I'm not going to say, oh, you only have a knife? Well, this isn't fair. Let me get a weapon of equal or lesser value in order to, no, that's not how warfare works. This is one of the reasons why people develop strong militaries, is so that people with less strong militaries, have a disincentive to attack them. It's perfectly reasonable.
Question from Wilhelm here. What made this topic come up as a Making the Argument episode?
We had 2 episodes where we were talking about Israel and Gaza. They actually did very well. It was some of our highest performing episodes that we ever did. So we thought that there was definitely an interest within our audience and within the population in general. And then I probably got more responses and more comments on these 2 than on anything else that we've ever done. And so we wanted a chance to address some of the comments and questions, because one, I wanted to give people who disagreed with me an opportunity to be able to make a case. And then we wanted to be able to fully kind of articulate, especially on some of the definitions and the terms that are used. So that's why we did it as an MTA episode.
This one's from Nicole. She says, I honestly don't know the answer to this. Do you think it was a fair election versus voting Hamas under duress?
I don't know. I don't know enough about, I really don't know enough about how that election took place in Gaza to be able to give you an informed opinion. And so it would just be shooting from the hip, and I don't want to do that. So I'm sorry.
Aristotle was not a fan of Plato, says, please ask Nick how he feels about the open-air prison that is Gaza.
I think it has a huge gate that you can walk right through in Egypt, and the Egyptians don't want people to go in there. And what do you mean an open-air prison? I thought they wanted the Israelis out of Gaza. Or do you think the Israelis should... So let me get this straight. Do you think the Israelis should leave Gaza and then open up the Israeli borders? Is that what you think should happen? Is that what you would do with like your own house? I think this is a disingenuous question. And again, it's part about using hyperbolic language in order to achieve your end state. You're not saying, Nick, do you think it's problematic given the lack of resources and mechanisms that the people of Gaza have to run an efficient state in this particular area. You're saying, what do you think about this open air prison? I apparently it's an open air prison where people get to do whatever they want, elect their own governments, start businesses, and receive billions of dollars in foreign aid. Sounds like a badass prison to me, dude. So please spare me. If you want to ask an honest question, then ask an honest question.
This question is from Grant, who's a very active member of our community. He says, could Palestine do anything to kick out Hamas, or is Hamas the Palestine gov?
Well, keep in mind when we're talking about Palestinians, right? So there's two areas that have elected representation for Palestinians. One is the West Bank and one is Gaza. So in Gaza, Hamas won the elections. In the West Bank, what was it? Fatah won the elections. So in Gaza, yeah, they could theoretically kick them out during the next election cycle. Question is,
they've never held another election, though. That's the problem.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Hamas kind of took power and is not so interested in democracy anymore. So that'll be the question: is whether or not following this. And here's how I would make sense of Israel's response at this point. I think they're trying to devastate Hamas so much that they're no longer effective as a political entity, and somebody else is going to be able to, potentially, win elections. Or now it could backfire. It could be that people get so furious that now Hamas has more power than it ever has before with respect to the culture and the people within the Gaza Strip. That remains to be seen.
Do y'all know how to pronounce this gentleman's name here?
Caravaggio.
Just want to make sure I didn't mess it up. He says, if we know Hamas has a highly developed tunnel system, what makes you think the shelling is effectively targeting them?
Well, so obviously you can have a highly developed tunnel system which doesn't necessarily protect all of your strategic infrastructure. So there's still ways that, not everything that Hamas has or that is of value to Hamas exists in one of these tunnels. So obviously Israel has a good idea of where some of these tunnels are and will probably strategically attempt to strike some of them in order to degrade their capability as a mechanism of either storing weapons or transferring military personnel, but then they'll also attack other targets that they've identified as being legitimate military targets.
Next question. Do you think Palestinians and Hamas, I suppose, are garnishing a lot of Western sympathy because it feels a little like Israel is punching down? We can overlook a lot to root for underdogs.
They're garnering a lot of sympathy because this is straight out of the cultural Marxist playbook.
Well, wait, but to his point, I will say this. I do think that there's something within, maybe not in I think there's something within human nature where we do have a tendency to kind of root for the underdogs. And it's certainly, I think in the West, you see like all of your feel-good stories about the people that are overcoming significant challenges in order to beat the odds, right? Okay, ironically enough, David and Goliath stories.
That's what I thought.
All right, David and Goliath stories. So I do think I do think that plays a psychological role. I also think the Palestinians have done I would say some of the better spokesmen for the Palestinians have certainly tried to create that image in Western minds because I think they know we're sympathetic to it. That doesn't mean we always show up and support the little guy, but there is something of a sympathy generated toward that.
When I hear the phrase Western sympathy, I think of the media and academia, though. I think of the cathedral. Sure. And those institutions are completely taken over by ideologically captured neo-Marxists who operate in this mindset of anybody that's quote unquote oppressed, we're going to elevate, and anybody that's an oppressor, we're going to vilify and demonize. And they've concluded that Jewish people are oppressors and that Palestinian people are the oppressed. And therefore, in order to seek out their goal, and their goal is power, it's not actually to liberate the oppressed. Their goal is simply power. They're using they're Lenin's useful idiots, right? Like, they're going to think about this for a second. For a long time, Jewish people were overwhelmingly allied with the political left. And then something has changed, arguably in the past decade or so, certainly in the past 2 weeks or so. The left really, really cared about Jewish people until suddenly they didn't. And the reason for it is because it no longer suits their ends.
Well,
if the Palestinian people discovered a massive gold mine under Gaza and then or oil, and then they became like, billionaire sheikhs, and they were building, artificial islands and multi-billion-dollar hotels on them.
We were watching YouTube videos about those islands.
If they became Dubai overnight, the left wouldn't care about them anymore. They'd go find some other victim, real or imagined, out there in order to champion, to try to tear down Western civilization and achieve political power. Yes, I'm taking a very cynical take on this, and I don't think it's an unjustified cynical take.
I think there's also a big difference between liberals and leftists. I think there's if we're counting liberal and leftist as kind of like opposite spectrums of the left, I think you still do find a lot of people that are liberals that are sympathetic potentially to both sides, or sympathetic to Israel. I think the left, for the reason that you mentioned, the hardcore left, I tend to agree that I don't think it's out of any genuine love for Palestinian culture or political history. I think they see them as useful with respect to the allocation of political power. All right.
We got time. We
got two more.
We've got two more questions. We're about to run up on 2.5 hours here.
Okay.
This one's from Wilhelm. He says, is it possible that Hamas doesn't want a Jewish state anywhere in the world?
It's not only possible, it's absolutely true. I don't think... and again, maybe I could be wrong on that. If someone who shows me the evidence to the contrary, I'd be happy to hear it. But I'm willing to bet Hamas doesn't want to see a Jewish state anywhere. And then what was the bottom question? Bandit 848 question. Nick Freitas, if he believes we were caught off guard on 9/11, why isn't it plausible that Israel could be caught off guard? I don't know if this was directed at me or the comment that I was responding to. I do think it's plausible that massive things can happen. Even when you have, a relatively well-financed, well-trained intelligence apparatus, I think the belief in the invincibility of intelligence organizations, I would again, I don't always chalk up to nefarious intention that which could be chalked up to incompetence, or just people making mistakes because they predicted one thing and something else happened. So I think sometimes to assume that everything is a conspiracy is to assign too much credit to the powers that be. And again, the reason I say this is because, I'm still involved in government. Now, I'm not claiming to be at the highest levels of government or anything like that. I'm a state legislator, right? But you spend enough time around politicians, and you spend enough time around decision makers, and you spend enough time around high-level bureaucats, and you realize that simply because they've attained a particular position doesn't mean they're geniuses. It doesn't mean they're brilliant. And so I think it's a fair question to ask, how could this have happened? One of the points that was brought up was that Israel had been experiencing a lot of domestic unrest because of issues that were happening with respect to judicial power. And, one side of that argument said that Benjamin Netanyahu and the more right-wing people were trying to strip kind of the independence of the courts. A lot of people on the right were making the argument that the way that Israeli courts, especially their Supreme Court, is set up, gives it so much power that it creates an imbalance between the legislature and the judiciary. Now, again, I think reasonable people can make arguments and disagree on that. And so the argument was, Netanyahu allowed this because he thought it would be a way to kind of solidify control and purpose within Israel in order to fight against Hamas. Look, if that is an argument that you want to make, that is within the realm of possibility, then you can certainly make that argument, and I'll certainly be open to the evidence presented in support of it. But I don't think it's the only explanation, and I'm going to be honest, I don't think it's the most likely explanation. I think the most likely explanation is that Iran is very concerned about ongoing peace talks between Arab countries, especially Saudi Arabia and Israel. I think Iran saw a benefit in encouraging an attack in Israel that would have elicited a massive response from Israel, because they think ultimately, on the whole, that's going to destabilize the whole peace process, at least for another 5 to 10 years. And I think that's the most plausible explanation for why it happened. Now, did Netanyahu let it happen because he also saw value in it with respect to domestic issues? Again, I don't think so, but I don't never blame people for being skepticism about what their governments are capable of actually doing when they think it's within their best interest. I don't happen to personally think it's the best explanation. All right. Well, I think that was it. Did we miss any super chats?
We did miss one. Give me one moment. Thank you for the reminder. Can't forget our super chat, folks. This one is from the passenger.
Yeah.
Why does Israel get most of the blame when Egypt also blockades Gaza and the refugees containing nations get hardly any criticism?
Because I don't. So for the pro-Palestinian position, it doesn't make sense for them to highlight that Egypt and other countries are not, allowing either immigration or providing greater support. And they would argue that they do provide some financial and humanitarian aid. They would argue that they do provide those things. But when it comes to things like the border and allowing them to come in, the important thing to remember here too is that there's a huge distance between Gaza and major population centers within Egypt, right? You got the Sinai Peninsula is incredibly sparsely populated. So the idea is could you effectively set up temporary refugee camps within that area in order to allow them to come back into Gaza when hostilities have cooled down? Yeah, theoretically you could, and there would certainly be enough foreign aid to probably support something like that. Egypt doesn't want to do it. And I think in part it's because of the reasons that Christian pointed out. Israel has not been the only country to have problems with Palestinian groups. Jordan and Egypt especially have had issues with these groups.
And Lebanon especially.
And Lebanon. Yeah, Lebanon to this day has had massive problems. So I think that's part of the reason why is if it's a pro-Palestinian narrative, it doesn't make sense to bring those points up.
Got two very quick super chats we're going to get to before we wrap the show. This one's from Kay Sloan. People love making moral judgments from their place of safety. Love this channel. I've learned so much.
No, thank you very much. And again, we're also trying to be respectful of the fact that it is a tense issue. There's a lot of high emotions on either side, and whenever you have innocent people being killed, regardless of who's responsible and regardless of what's taking place, that obviously elicits a lot of emotion, right? And so I at no point, even though I believe that, again, Israel has a right to exist as a state, I don't ever want to make light of the fact that there are, non-combatants being harmed as a result of this conflict. And whereas I might put the vast majority of the blame for that on Hamas, that doesn't mean I don't want Israel to take every reasonable precaution as they're conducting military operations to try to protect innocent civilian life.
Last super chat here from Isaac. If we listened to all the emotional arguments being made today back in World War II and didn't get involved, then the Jews would have been wiped out.
I mean, I'll tell you what. There's Christian and I have actually toyed around with the idea of doing some alt history. Our friend Rudyard over on What If Alt Hist does a really good job. Some of the best work I've ever seen on doing like kind of theories and discussing what would happen in alternate history scenarios. But I think to Isaac's larger point, the question is how involved should the United States or other countries be in wars that maybe aren't seen as their own? And I tend to be, I would say, a lot more cautious than what you might call your typical Republican, right? Like, Senator Cotton is far more willing to get involved in military engagements than I am, even though we might both happen to be Republicans. I'm a lot more skeptical of the efficacy of U.S. involvement in a lot of things, but I'm not a pacifist. And I do think that there are times where it is important to get involved in a conflict that, even if it's not directly threatening your borders, that doesn't mean that there isn't, potential strategic or even maybe at times moral implications. I'm just going to be a lot more cautious before we dedicate forces to that, because I fully recognize that other people are going to fight a war. And this is one of the things that I tell people. I have a lot of respect for groups like the Free Burma Rangers and David Eubank. Or Victor Marx and some of these other groups where they go out and they combat human trafficking, or with David Eubank, they help the Karen rebels try to, with medical care and support because they're being brutalized by the Myanmar government. Did
the Free Burma Rangers fight against the I'm trying to remember the name to describe the Burmese military.
I don't. So it's not
the military junta that runs the country.
Typically, what they do, it's not like the Free Burma Rangers go in and conduct active military operations against the government. What they do is they generally provide humanitarian aid and assistance to people that are fleeing, and they will try to provide protection. Now, in the process of moving them they will definitely provide security and things of that nature. But a lot of what they do is medical in nature. Now, they also went into Syria when ISIS was in there, and they were recovering children that had been sold into slavery, that their parents had been killed, and they were also providing that. The reason why I bring them up is because I have a lot of respect for people that have the courage of the convictions, and they say this is a problem, and so I'm going to do something. They're not necessarily demanding that the United States government go to war. They're saying this is my conviction, and I'm willing to put myself in harm's way in order to try to improve it. And I have a great deal of respect for that. I think it's another thing, and we should be far more cautious when we're encouraging governments to go to war. But sometimes war is better than the alternative, as bad as war is, and I will stand by that. All righty. I think we've gone through all of the questions. Let me go ahead and just kind of finish this out. For the people that, commented, again, hey, look, I always welcome people commenting. You're going to notice something. I don't typically block people or things like that, even if they're, saying things against me. For the people that commented me privately and wanted me to go over some of the information that they sent, you're probably not happy with the conclusions I came to. But I do appreciate that you were willing to send it to me. I do appreciate that you were willing to be very civil. Look, I think that reasonable people can disagree on certain things. The thing that I cannot accept is I cannot accept terrorism as a legitimate force in order to achieve political objectives. And that's regardless of who's conducting it. But terrorism also has a definition. Genocide has a definition. Apartheid has a definition. Ethnic cleansing has a definition. And when these things are used inappropriately, or when I don't think there's sufficient evidence to justify their use, I start to become skeptical of other people's analysis. And so one of the things I do want to say thank you is to the people that didn't use those terms, but still tried to make some distinction and still tried to advocate for what they saw as either the plight of the Palestinian people or what they might believe is justification for a Palestinian state. The thing that I'm going to go back to is I'm willing to consider other options, provided that we're not endorsing terrorism as a legitimate means of conducting military operations or achieving political objectives. And two, I'm just going to tell you right now, my position is I'm not accepting a solution that doesn't allow Israel to remain as a state in the Levant. I think they have a right to a state there. I think they have a right to a Jewish homeland. I think for historical reasons, that makes it makes sense for it to be there. And I'm going to remain pretty firm in that position. That doesn't mean I believe that the United States government has some overwhelming obligation to secure Israel's statehood, but I do believe Israel has a right to defend itself. And to that end, I don't think that's an unreasonable position. And I hope at the very least I've been able to articulate why I think there is a logical, historical, rational, and moral argument for that. I'm certainly not denying the idea. I'm certainly not denying or disregarding the perspective of Palestinians who want their own state in the region. But if their state has to come at the expense of Israel, then I don't think that's a fair negotiation. And my hope is that there will be some negotiated settlement where we don't only have a political solution, but we actually have cultures both within Israel and within any sort of Palestinian state that might arise, where we actually have the cultural push to make it successful. And that is going to have to include some sort of agreement that Israel does have a right to exist in peace and security, and that it isn't justifiable to kill innocent civilians in order to achieve your political objectives. Hamas doesn't seem to be interested in that. And so I will make a distinction between Hamas and the Palestinian people, but the only way that you're going to get rid of Hamas ultimately is if the Palestinian people decide to reject them. And so I do think they are going to have to make that decision. So I hope that even if you don't agree with us, we've been intellectually honest, consistent, and hopefully fair. But once again, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for the comments that you sent. Thank you for the questions that were asked. We really appreciate all your participation. Consider joining our community chat over in Circle. That's where we get a lot of ideas for our episodes. And
link in the description.
Link is in the description. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.
And thank you to Good Ranchers.
And of course, thank you to Good Ranchers. Again, go get Good Ranchers. Make everyone feel better.